Good morning, everyone. Thank you. It does feel very special to be able to welcome you all to the second conference day, although I see quite a few new faces and lots of smiling faces, which is great. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your contributions yesterday and hopefully today. I think we had a very productive day, if I may say so, yesterday, packed with research presentations. But today we're looking forward to making that leap from academia and to see what the science can bring to the world of policy and making that bridge, whether it's through governments, businesses, local community organizations, foundations, and much, much more. And I can't think of anyone better to kick us off today than Lord O'Donnell. Thank you for being with us today. I know it took quite a bit. Gus served as the Cabinet Secretary, which is the most senior person across all of the civil service in the United Kingdom, and he did so across 3 prime ministers. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. And Gus had a hand in all the major initiatives that are so dear to all of our hearts, I think. So thank you, Gus. Gus's career combines the policy, academic, and business worlds. So again, I can't think of anyone better to kick us off on this interactive day that combines the 3. Thank you, Gus.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm just checking that this mic is working, yeah? Good. Okay, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm sorry that yesterday there were some political events that may have distracted from your message, but I hear it went incredibly well, and in other respects I think yesterday went incredibly well from a constitutional point of view, that our system worked, and we now have a change in Prime Minister, so, and that process will continue, ideally rather quicker than was originally intended. Right, by an outgoing Prime Minister. So I'm delighted to be here today, not least because I think this event, more than any other, marks the coming of age of the global well-being movement. And I kind of feel I've been there at the beginning, and that for me is really, really exciting. So today I want to suggest how we turn all the great ideas, and I've seen the things that were going on yesterday. I've looked at the growing number of papers around this, and basically fantastic research, fantastic ideas, but we now need to turn them into reality. We now need to turn them into real influence on policy. I think that's what today I want to concentrate on, how you turn all this into political policy development. I'm going to concentrate on the UK because that's what I know well, but actually, you can see this happening globally, and I think it always helps when you're advising a Prime Minister to be able to point to other countries that are doing it and doing it successfully. And I hear you had the Prime Minister of Iceland, and that's just, showing you Iceland, New Zealand. I have to say the Prime Minister of New Zealand was, of course, a Cabinet Office civil servant working for me, right, where she learnt it all. Yeah, so that was great. So let me go back a little history in the UK side, and I think what explains the nature of the political problem that we face as well. So back to 2010, the indefatigable, that's a great word to use, David Halpern, came to me and said that David Cameron was interested in new ideas, and I had spoken to him in the way that Cabinet Secretaries in our system are allowed to. When we have an election, you're allowed to go and speak to the opposition about things they want to do. And he talked about behavioural science, and he talked about setting up a nudge unit. And that was great. So we talked through that. But I was like, what about the well-being side of things? And it was really interesting that there was this contrast that nudging was very trendy and has become very trendy around the world. Lots of behavioural scientists, Nobel Prizes for that sort of thing. I have one of them, Nobel Prize winner in front of me, which makes me very nervous. So I was kind of keen that actually, if we're talking about behaviour change, why are you changing behaviour? And the answer is you're changing behaviour because you want to improve well-being. So if you go down the route of having a nudge unit, but you haven't thought about well-being, there's a bit of a problem. So, and then, I'm pleased to say, David Halpern said I should meet this visiting academic, a chap called Danny Kahneman. And so Danny came into the cabinet room, cabinet secretary's office, which is a very splendid office, I'm glad to say, which often prime ministers cover, and we just managed to, in good Sir Humphrey style, get a shot of them. We had a great discussion about all of these issues, and I'm really pleased that Danny is now in the life satisfaction camp, as I hear, so that's great. So the nudge unit went well, and the wellbeing stuff paused, and I'll come to that. The nudgers, if you think about the kind of political problems they had to overcome, first of all, a lot of people were saying, well, you're imposing a nanny state. You know, you're trying to tell people how to live their lives. And I think of us, and I'm going to call us the Welbys, we've had to face criticisms about imposing our view of what constitutes a good life. If you think about The Good Life, that book by the Skidelsky's, saying, you know, these are the things that are important. In addition, well-being, for a number of politicians I talked to on the left, they associate it with spas and fluffy stuff, right? And trying to get them to kind of say, no, this is serious. And they say, well, yeah, but I really care about poverty. I really care about inequality. They're the buzzwords for the left. So you get these attacks of it's fluffy, it's subjective. And I was really pleased to see Andrew talking about subjective and referring to the place that we both learnt our economics at Nuffield College, Oxford, just down the road. I was very proud to be at Nuffield. I was there obviously to play football, not to learn economics, but really enjoyed the economics. But it was the whole question that I think economists found dealing with subjective stuff very difficult. And actually, I think we all now realise that feelings matter, and that possibly getting objective measures of feelings as well will be really important in winning that debate. So we had these political fears both about nudging and about well-being. We started off the nudge unit very modestly with things that nobody could argue about. They were like raising revenue by putting in bits in letters to people that owed us tax. And basically that was to get the Treasury on board. We wanted to build support for liberal paternalism. And if you think about what we were doing at the time, this is one of the challenges I faced, was how do you put together a coalition government? We'd never done that nationally. So we had a kind of centrist Conservative Party coupled with the Liberal Democrats, so you can see how liberal paternalism would work. And in fact, we used that. And so the nudge thing politically could work with that political background. Well-being, on the other hand, actually, to my mind, requires a rather bigger vision. And it's hard for governments to come up with really good visions. You know, I remember I was in the States when Ronald Reagan as Prime Minister talked about the vision thing. Yeah, actually, or it may have been Bush, you know, I come to think of it. But I think it was Bush, yeah. The vision thing. And I think that's one of the things we need to think about really hard. And getting a vision thing on well-being with the coalition was particularly hard, as I think Joe would back up there, Joe Swinson. So what we did was concentrate on laying the foundations for a future government, if it so desired, to propound a vision based on raising the well-being of the nation. And that meant three things, right? First of all, as a good economist who knows about evidence, we had to get data. That, to my mind, was the most significant thing that we did. John was there at the launch with the ONS, where we actually got David Cameron, who, to be honest, wasn't the biggest proponent of well-being. To actually stand up there and say, the ONS, God bless them, we're going to measure the four things which we've got, and that was an enormous step forward. Large data set, not perfect by any means, but you know, when you think about we live with GDP, and my goodness, lots of things wrong with that. So really, that to me was really interesting. So once you get the data, then you need to make sure that that provides interesting insights and clear policy prescriptions. And I think the contributions to this conference show that people are now starting to use this data, and it's not just kind of the odd graph here and there. We're starting to see lots of academic papers, people in this audience. This whole conference has got really serious stuff, academic work being used, which to my mind is where the academic world should be, which is developing real insights which actually really drive policymakers and policy advisors like me to be able to say what we should do. So it's absolutely crucial. And the third step really was that what was happening to wellbeing was really important for governments and their electorates. That is, I would say, still work in progress. So in the UK, again, having done all of that, we've then made more progress on has been important. We've now got guidelines in the Green Book. It is the policy officials' Bible. We have the handbook for wellbeing policy making, Paul Fritters and Christian Keckel. That's done. We've got charities like State of Life thinking about how you might use this stuff. That's all working well. The point is, and this is where I want to concentrate, take up by most senior politicians remains incredibly disappointing. And I fear the current government, curiously enough, is a little distracted. And I don't expect that to change anytime soon. There is an opportunity for a new Prime Minister coming in with a new cabinet to decide that they're going to do this. I think the nature of the debate that's going to carry on in terms of the leadership battle is going to mean it's hard to get that through now. But we'll see. I haven't given up. I hope the success of other governments. You look at New Zealand, you talked about Iceland. Politicians they're very attracted to what's been popular elsewhere. They're very attracted to finding out who's getting political success. You just have to be at a G7 or a G20 conference to see them all gather around a politician who's just won an election. They are gold dust, right? And everyone wants to talk to the one who's won an election. It's just, that's what motivates them, right? So that's where we need to get. We need to really big up the work that successful governments are doing. And then we need to think about, what is this vision going to look like? How can we get something inspirational there? So, tackling poverty and inequality and creating a fair society. You've heard that from everybody. Fair, just to be clear, every kind of focus group that comes along that I've been through all the political parties will tell you the most important word to include is fair. Nobody really knows what fair means, and they all have different interpretations of fair. So, how do we manage this? And I would say, if you view it through a well-being lens, I think this translates as actually creating a society that first and foremost tackles the causes of low well-being. Andrew mentioned this in his paper. You can use various words, but some people call it misery. But thinking about a focus of policies that actually inspires voters by saying we're going to look after the least well-off groups in our society and the people who are having the most miserable existence. I think that works. I wouldn't recommend to a Prime Minister they go out there and say, right, what we're going to do is take people who are really happy and make them blissful. Not going to work, right? We do need, though, on the other hand, to think about, so those people who are in the lower to middle income groups, how do we manage for them? And I think this is going to be the challenge for that vision. And this is what kind of a challenge I put out to you, because I don't have an answer for it. How do we sort out with the cost of living crisis, which we know is going to get worse? Real incomes are going to be falling for a large part of our population, and this is going to be global, not UK specific. How do you help through that? And we know, I think a lot of the wellbeing research has shown this, it's very asymmetric. Falls in income are you really notice them as opposed to increases. And of course, increases in incomes and well-being tend to be associated, in my description, and politicians will back this up, I've done really well, I've improved my income. If my income has fallen or my well-being is falling, the government screwed up, right? That's the way it works. So that, I think, is really, really important. So, yeah, looking at inequalities in well-being, looking at low well-being, I think is really important. Also, I think one subject that nobody's really much focused on is well-being mobility. So there's a lot of people, particularly, again, actually you'll find this cross-party, who worry about social mobility. And I'm kind of, and social mobility, as everyone will know, we've had millions of policies to try and tackle and improve social mobility, and very, very few of them have made any impact whatsoever. What about well-being mobility? How do we take people from very low to middle to upper levels? Is that likely? I mean, you know, what's the path through which we should go? So I think that's a really, really important subject to do. What do we need for all of that? Well, we need lots of data. We need some micro data. We need some research. We need people willing to fund that sort of research. I think those things are really important. In the UK, we've got a Levelling Up white paper, which establishes a mission to raise well-being throughout the UK. The interesting thing about that is Andy Haldane, who, a very good friend, with me, my support, set up a charity called Pro Bono Economics, which I hope a lot of you have heard about, which is dedicated to improving well-being by focusing on the impact of charities. Andy's chairing a group to monitor progress on the missions in the white paper. It's the kind of thing, I think, which actually will be there across the parties. I think there's some parts of that Levelling Up white paper which will work and which people can pick up. And I was very keen that Andy was there to write this stuff and put it in the white paper, and he's now outside of it again, which is smart, because it's going to be a bit of a not a great period for a while government sorts itself out. So nothing much is going to happen. But if he can put in place some metrics to govern how we're improving that well-being, that's a great opportunity for all of us. And, you know, can you imagine a government coming in and saying they're not in favour of this? I think, you know, all the main political parties have been very clear that they are behind this agenda. So I think they can all embrace the goal, whilst, as political parties have to do, differentiating their product by explaining the different ways in which they'd achieve it. And I think that's where we come in, as to giving the evidence base as to what those different ways are, and promoting the ones we think are really good. And we know, thanks to the great work by George Ward, that incumbent governments gain political support if well-being goes up, and suffer if it diminishes during their time in office. That's a pretty strong incentive, actually. So we need to understand the nature and causes of the problems people face. I think there's a lot of scope to make progress from using a bottom-up approach. So if you think about local governments, they are much closer to their electorates. Regional mayors have demonstrated, I think, an empathy with their people. They become, which basically transcends party politics. I think the Be Well project in Greater Manchester, brilliant example of what can be achieved, bringing together a wide range of local groups, and their work has already identified some really interesting well-being inequalities associated with gender identity, sexual orientation and transgender status, which hadn't come out from other work. You've seen progress around the UK. Scotland's doing some interesting stuff. Wales, intergenerational work. So, you know, we can see this in the devolved, we can see it at a local level, we can see it at mayors. I remember many years ago going down to a trip to meet the mayor of Bristol, who was trying to make Bristol a well-being city by wearing red trousers, which was interesting. You know, London Mayor is now incorporating well-being impacts into decision-making in our capital. So there is progress there. To facilitate all of this at the political level, there's something everybody in this room needs to do, which is quite hard. And that's, you need to let go of some things that you value a lot. And that is the language. Like I said, politicians want to use their own language. I remember, just give you one example, and Joe will know this. I remember sitting down with Nick Clegg, as the leader of the Liberal Democrats coming into coalition and talking to him about something which I thought they'd really like, which was the charity sector and the whole big society approach. And Nick said, no. Big society, conservative words, no chance. And it was like, it wasn't whether it was a good policy or not, it was just no. And so you really need to understand that for some people, well-being may be the right word. For others, it may be a complete turn-off. To be honest, I'm just interested in the policies and the results we have. I don't care what language we use. People care a lot about language. Politicians care a lot about language. And they'll care about language because they've gone to their focus groups and, you know, whether that's sensible or not. But I think we need to be prepared to let go. And we need to be prepared to get to the policies that matter. So that's where I think we need to go with the various stages of government. Private sector, I think, has a really important role here. We've seen from the work that Jan has done on the relationship between well-being and productivity. We've seen, I looked at George Ward's paper on quantifying the potential gains from thinking about well-being and the whole Indeed stuff. I think that is absolutely crucial. This is an area where I think we can make progress really rapidly. When I left government, doing various things that pay me absolutely nothing. But one thing that pays me quite well is I'm on the board of Brookfield Asset Management. We've just hired Mark Carney. Mark is an example of putting the data and formulation behind the E of ESG. So net zero is being quantified. It's really important in the commercial world because, you know, S&P is now looking at greenwashing debates and all the rest of it. You've got to get this right. It will matter enormously for investment and for what companies do. We need to translate that now into the S. The S is completely underdeveloped in ESG. So we need to have sensible measures of S. And for me, that will look at a company's social agenda, which will resolve around the well-being of its employees, customers, suppliers, and the communities in which they operate. We need to make that real. And we need to work with companies, with regulators, with investors, to see how all of that can come together. There are some examples. The construction sector actually is doing some interesting work on that. But that is a massive challenge for our movement, and I'm really keen that the well-being movement can actually take that on board. In addition to the public and private sectors, we should not forget the civic sector. This, to me, is something which never gets the amount of weight it should do. Andy Haldane and I are working on this. I'm chairing a thing called the Andrew Law Commission on Civil Society, because I remember as an economist, you know, you do your economics 101, you have the public sector, the private sector, and that was it, right? Curiously enough, there is a third group called, and we shouldn't call them the third group because they are really, really important, called civil society, which actually gets at the parts other things can't reach. Charities, community groups, volunteering associations, they have a massive impact on well-being at a local level. That was highlighted during the pandemic. You know, the emergence of food banks, neighbours shopping for each other, volunteers putting vaccines in my arm. I mean, these things just arose, and that's an amazingly powerful group. And they're an amazingly powerful political group to have on your side. So I think that, to me, again, something really, really important. Foundations, they can play a critical role in this process by funding both projects and mission-oriented research, and by working out some of the ways in which we get the infrastructure of charities to be able to measure their impact in the right ways. These things are really important, and I think some of Andrew Oswald's chilling slides show how important that is, that we actually are able to tackle these real problems of very low well-being. And finally, at the individual level, we need to promulgate an understanding that it is possible to improve your well-being, and that governments, employers, and civil society stand ready to help, and for individuals to have access to that. Because we know that many of the issues on well-being relate to families, they relate to all sorts of issues like social media and things like that, and we need to make sure that we come together and that we have the policies that work on that. Sometimes there'll be legislation, mostly they won't be, I think. In my view, the best way to start is with children. Parents want their children to have fulfilling, satisfying lives. That requires the education system to move away from their endless obsession with exams. I was at a Times CEO conference the other day where Michael Gove, when he was in cabinet, was asked about the Times education. They'd done a big work of research work on education, and Michael said, no, our problem is we don't have enough exams. And the CEOs laughed, right? We just need to get across to people that what CEOs want are individuals who have resilience, who can work in teams. It's not their individual exam performance that is, there's nothing wrong with doing well in particular things, but there are far more skills that matter. So that, I think, is really important. Children, hence that's why Be Well Project, Healthy Minds, all those sorts of things, really, really important. One other, possibly more controversial point, a lot of researchers are working on modifications to GDP, right? Designed to make GDP a more accurate measure of success. That's not where I am, and I don't really understand that debate, to be perfectly honest. The subjective well-being movement is really about placing much more weight on individuals' own perceptions of their lives. These approaches, GDP, subjective well-being, are fundamentally different. Personally, I use GDP as a measure of activity, not utility. And that's where it should be in my book. So trying to kind of muck around with GDP, fine, but we need to have that argument. So where are we on the World Wellbeing Movement? Well, we've come a long way. Globally, we have the World Happiness Report. It's great to see John Halliwell here. They've done some amazing work, looked at responses to COVID around the world. I think when we do that, it's a brilliant opportunity to actually harness all of this work that everyone's been doing on issues like, did it make sense to close schools? The implications for mental health, for kids, for parents, versus transmission issues. All of these trade-offs between all of these different things. You really need a well-being metric. You need well-beings to actually bring all of those together. So that's, I think, really important that globally we have countries that are taking this up. In the UK, we've got lots of positive things moving forward. The What Works Centre, Nancy's wonderful What Works Centre. Bringing together the evidence, that's fantastic. Here, Jans, Oxford University Wellbeing Research Centre, brilliant. Thanks for all the sponsors. I think all of the researchers that have been involved in this that have helped us along the way. I think of going back to Easterlin, obviously of Danny, Andrew, Richard Layard, who has nagged me forever on various subjects, Paul Dolan, who's inspiring people. Everyone in this room, I just want to say a big thank you to you, because you are, to my mind, what's the future? This is going to happen, right? It's like you can see the whole behavioural revolution, and now we've got economics with a fundamental change in what constitutes this place to start, as opposed to the place that Jim Murley's taught me to start, which was maximising utility subject to various budget constraints, and let's assume that all individuals are the same because it's a bit easier. That's, I think, something that we need to work on. But these people have just been brilliant. We need to build on them. We need to build on the grassroots movements, like I say, the volunteers, the charities, people at Action for Happiness, all of those things. Probiotic Economics, I hope is doing that. And we need to get the institutions in the right place. And big shout out to Liz McEwen and everything that ONS has done. That first thing when we started to measure the data, people were saying, we'll do this for a little bit, and then the mood will change and we'll move away from it. Actually, it's a national statistic now, so that makes it really hard to move away from it. We are, the ONS, God bless them, we're also looking at this world where can we measure the contribution of civic society, which is like, for now, I keep saying this, those people that believe in GDP, if everyone who's volunteering and helping out in charities gives that up and goes to work on prostitution or illegal drugs, then GDP goes up, How mad is that, right? It just shows you that we should not be in that world. So we need ONS to be doing this. So finally, I think our movement, as I said, is coming of age. And with adulthood comes the responsibility to leave the world a better place. I think people are increasingly understanding that actually what matters to their lives is their well-being. They're using language which is different. They're realizing that there is more to life than just money. You see it in things like, and this really annoys me, you see the debate now about the recession we're going through. And a lot of economists saying, well, it's terrible. GDP is going to fall because all these over 50s, lazy so-and-sos, have decided that they don't like commuting and they want to spend more time at home. This is terrible. You know, GDP is going to go down. I'm like, okay, run that by me again. People have themselves chosen something they prefer, and we're going to say this is bad? I mean, to use the technical term. So, I think basically my message is to politicians to wake up and embrace this radical agenda. It's there. It's, you know, it's so compelling. And it's about people's perceptions of their own lives. What could be more relevant to individuals? So I think it's there. I'm kind of like puzzled as to why they haven't picked it up, just as I'm puzzled by why all of that economics I learned about companies knowing how to maximize their profits, why they haven't sorted out the well-being stuff themselves. You know, we need to work out what's the, in that case, the market failure, what's the political failure. That means we haven't got there. That, again, is a work in progress. I can't answer that now. But believe me, for the party and the politicians that get this, the future will be theirs, and it will be a better, more sustainable future for all of us. Thank you. I don't know if they're going to let me answer questions. There's a guy got his hand up there, but I'm in your hands, so you probably need to move on.
Yeah, and it's over to Nancy.
Fantastic.
Well,
Okay, sorry, I'm happy to answer it.
Sure, people would have loved. Thank you. It's quite a hard act to follow, the Cabinet Secretary. Right. Thank you so much. It's brilliant to be here, and I want to say a massive thank you to Jan and his team, because this is real progress. So when I was doing this in, I think, 2005, we were playing with the life satisfaction and social capital data as I was trying to do a cost-benefit analysis to changes to the electoral system. And I can put the costs on there, but I couldn't put, under the regular system, I couldn't put any benefits. So I was working with my economist, I was working with my statistician, and we couldn't work out the answer. And that's what really got me thinking, what makes good policy? Rather than saying, oh, this is just a good thing. Of course there are well-being benefits. Can we put some numbers to these things? And so we were trying to put on, how do you know this is a good law? How do you know this is a good policy? Is it improving lives? And how do you know if it's improving lives? You ask them. And that is the change that we were able to do. So I'm joined with a fantastic panel who've been absolutely instrumental in making this work over the last, I think, easily since 2008. And so I've got Sarah McLennan, who's an economic analyst with the Government Economics Service, who's going to talk to us about the changes to the Treasury Green Book guidance to allow us to use wellbeing evidence with confidence, robustness and consistency across departments. Amanda Rowlett, who has led this across government with the Social Impacts Task Force as well. We've got Liz McCohen, who is now head of data and analysis, is that right, at the Office for National Statistics. Reason I wasn't looking at Gus when he mentioned my organisation was because the ONS have today released a 2-weekly subjective wellbeing data. So you can see that for the UK today. So I was just sharing that on Twitter, which is so exciting. And I'm really grateful that Joe Swinson's been able to join us today. And Joe has been leading this in Parliament since, easily 2008, and set up the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Wellbeing Economics. So really helps tackle some of what Gus was talking about the sort of the political leadership of this and the really challenging political economy. And we know that government can do three things. It can tax, it can spend, and it can regulate. And we also know that public policy is about decision making about what the government and the public sector does and doesn't do and how. And some of these things around improving well-being are very firmly for public policy, whether that's economic policy, health policy. There is a role for all of those departments in improving well-being. But it's also for the other sectors as well, and that's the point of our organisation at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. So if you happen to have a fantastic 2 days listening to the latest wellbeing research in places like this, it's fantastic, it's such a joy, and it is my job to do it, and it's still quite a hard time to do it. But we need to make this information available to everybody as a public good so they can make decisions for their business, for their families, for their cities, to make these decisions available about what actually makes a difference to improve well-being. So we're trying to understand what organisations can do in government, in business, in civil society, and how we can learn from the things that they're doing as a system to really scoop that learning back up again. So we're now at the stage where we can use some of this evidence with confidence in the systems of government. And I wanted to ask Sarah a little bit about the changes that have happened to the Green Book. And what does it tell us? What does it allow us to do?
Super, thanks Nancy. And as a reminder of what Gus mentioned, Green Book is this manual for cost-benefit analysis in government. It's how we do policy analysis on well-being. How do you include well-being in cost-benefit analysis? And I led a group to write this guidance with actually work from a very large number of people who are in this room and advice from people in this room. So a big thank you to everyone who is there. And it is now Treasury guidance. It's there for those to be followed. The vision for this guidance is that those who are making decisions, those in a policy-making capacity, have the access to the information about what is important for well-being, and they can use that to guide decisions. And from my side, as an analyst, we've got the data, we know where to find the data, and we've got the tools to be able to provide that advice to help those better decisions, to move people out of misery and to also improve well-being. And this moves things on quite a way. The various different aspects in this guidance, for those who haven't seen it, is it starts with a bit of an overview of the basics. For those who are a beginner in the well-being sphere, which a lot of people are, everything from what is important to well-being. Hey, relationships are important. Don't just worry about profits when you're thinking about things. Think about all these things that you can't measure. Also the types of things that you might do differently with policy analysis. Think about comparisons, not just where you are. Think about relative positions. What people say might not actually be what has the greatest impact on their well-being. All these different things, it's a bit of a beginner's guide in this guidance. And then it moves on to assisting people how you might have well-being for your objectives. And also when you're scoping out your policies, what you might want to think about. You might need to think about where do people have the lowest well-being if you're wanting to try to focus a certain policy. What type of groups might you want to do? What type of options or ideas might you want to think about? And it's helping people how to generate those aspects in the policy-making process. And it then moves on to the section, mainly for analysts like me, how do you include this in cost-benefit analysis? How do you get your data? How do you include well-being? And well-being has been included in cost-benefit analysis. It is the basis of it. You are trying to get at an idea of welfare when you are doing cost-benefit analysis, and we have been monetizing it through a range of different measures for a long time. And this guidance sets out that's what we do through environmental measures, through stated preference, through revealed preference. A lot of this is out there already, and when you are looking at these measures, this is you trying to get an idea or a proxy for well-being. The new step in the guidance is then saying we're also putting a value on a 1-point change in life satisfaction per year. And this is then where we are confident in this change. This is a value that you can use, and it's 13,000 with a range of 10 up to 16,000 based on a review of the approaches which are out there. And as a starting point, it's considered, okay, this is good enough for now to start the debate, start people using it and see if we can test it and see how that then comes out in policies. It moves things on because having a figure for well-being then means that we have actually had quite a lot of asks from people to say, well, what is the well-being impacts of this policy? Do you have this impact? What is this? I've got this very specific group. How can you tell me that information? It increases that demand for people then wanting to use it, which then increases the demand for asking about the data. And it runs then this group of trying to improve it and include it in what people are thinking about. And in terms of how things have moved on, and I can see that. It's not only the analysts who are interested in this, but even, for example, in DEFRA, in the investment committee, they're asking, have you considered this guidance before they then take a decision? It is not only bottom up through the analysts asking for this information, it is then top down. When it's in the right decision-making structures, there are then people who are checking that they have been considering these different bits of evidence. I would like to perhaps give some of my views on the challenges and where we are, and I know that the others will continue from that. I'll probably start with on the smaller side and then build up. I think on the kind of the micro scale, bottom up, as I said, lots of people have been asking, hey, we've got this very specific group in this specific location. What is the well-being impact of this specific change? And we don't always have that data. And you can then use proxies and you give approximations, which is good enough for now. But there is a lot of requests for some areas where we just don't have information. Luckily, though, there is a move towards more evaluation, and what's also set out in the guidance is how to evaluate well-being. Make sure that you're evaluating this so we can improve this information that's there. And there's also a movement towards test, learn, adapt. Try it out in a small group. Test what that impact is, learn from that, and then adapt and make things move on from it. Which is all very well and good. We'll get more information to lead into these cost-benefit analyses, but there's no point in having an absolutely perfect cost-benefit analysis with all the perfect figures of the well-being impacts for this group if your cost-benefit analysis is pointing in the wrong direction. If you have assessed what the potential well-being impacts are of 2 infrastructure schemes for a group, whereas actually the bigger impact for changing their well-being would have been improving the relationships or having therapy. And that is the challenge of where we're thinking around what we're looking at, making sure that the objectives are going in the right direction. And there is still this question, and that's more for the realms of politics and the other areas which Gus has been talking on. But related to that is making sure that the evidence is in the right place at the right time. And this goes beyond well-being. This is the question of when there is a certain decision that is being made, there is advice which is given, and that advice which is being given is using the best evidence which is available at that time and making sure that that person can get the evidence at the right time and that person has this information about well-being that they can also put in, and they've got the right information about this group which can also feed in. It means that there's a lot of right person at the right time with the right information about the right well-being which needs to happen. And that is why enough work, which others are going to talk about, around making sure that this is just part of this body of evidence which people have, part of this body of not only the analysts but policymakers is really important, and part of this wider issue, this wider, I suppose, step forward in this journey of making sure that evidence is well and truly part of and parcel of the policy process.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and I think we'll have a chance to ask some questions, which is, but just say thank you so much for everything you've done. We talk about policymakers as one sort of entity, and there are actually lots of different people in that box of people. There's politicians, which is one we often think of, but there are also policy officials, which is what I was for a long time. We have government analysts and economists, and then we also have statisticians, as well as elected officials and parliamentarians. And so I'm going to turn to see how the journey has happened for the government economists. Do you want to just tell a little bit about what you were trying to do and where it's going?
Sure. About 15 years ago, I had, as one does, a conversation with Richard Layard and with others, and we set up a cross-government, we call it the Social Impacts Task Force, but essentially what it's doing is looking at well-being amongst the analysts and how to promote its use across the analysts. So we started that about 15 years ago, and initially we started by understanding what departments were doing, and already it was on the agenda to some extent, but we quickly came up against the issue of there not being systematic data on it. ONS were doing the questions in parallel, and we worked across departments and with ONS to get those questions on as many surveys as possible. And I would be sending out these emails saying, you've got this survey and you haven't yet put the ONS questions on. So it was this sort of coordinated effort. We also quickly realised that whilst the surveys were hugely important, the evaluations absolutely had to have wellbeing, so you were really understanding the impact and the relationship between wellbeing and other things, and highlighting the significant wellbeing impact to politicians, to decision makers. So we worked on those. We also worked on sharing knowledge on what analysis was being done, what policy was being developed. We had a number of seminars where we brought in academics as well as talking about the analytical work in-house. And what was really gratifying is they would sell out immediately. You will remember this.
Yes,
You put
so
on
good.
200 economists and the social researchers, and they'd be gone in like half an hour or something. I mean, there's a huge interest in this, which is really, really gratifying. So we progressed on, the ONS measures became entrenched, people became more used to using it. The word wellbeing, it's interesting Gus says that, the word wellbeing has always been difficult. We considered changing the name from Social Impacts Task Force, which sounds terribly sort of instrumental, to wellbeing, and then it became clear that wasn't going to help us necessarily in the positions of power. Then the obvious thing to do was to improve our tools, and that's where Sarah and her group came in to do what is quite a really major piece of work, to create an authoritative piece of guidance, not only articulates what matters, but also gives some values. When the values, I was quite worried about the values because we all know academics come up with a very wide range of figures, but Sarah went and talked to many of you, and I think the value of having something authoritative that people can hang their hat on was such that agreement was broadly reached across groups. So this was published, was it just a year
July
ago?
2021.
Just a year ago. This was published a year ago in the middle of COVID, which in some ways was good because people were thinking a lot about well-being. We gave it a good push. It had a lot of support from the Treasury, and so we gave it a push internally when it was published, and we're now working to get it part of the institutional structure and the way people work. I mean, on the positive side, we've got Sarah, before she went on maternity leave, set up a networking group across all departments with a lot of enthusiasts to promote it in their department, to learn lessons from each other. And these were self-nominated people who wanted to sort of stand up and make it happen. So that's been really good. The Treasury spent a lot of time assessing it and commenting on it, which did delay us somewhat, but had the wonderful benefit of them really buying into it. The top of the Treasury are hugely supportive. The Treasury team that assess whether people have analysed their projects appropriately do feel they own it and are supportive of it and promote it. And then across departments, the word is going out both through the network and also to an extent more strategically, largely through the existence of the guidance and people's support for it. So on the positive side, we have the frameworks and the systems in place, and we have a lot of support and a lot of enthusiasm from a range of places. For the challenges, it just takes a long time to change behaviours, and the well-being word not being a comfortable one for some people is also a challenge. So we basically need to continue with our efforts and continue to push it and never to say, right, it's done, always to try and move forward. One last comment, and Gus referred to this, the Levelling Up initiative, which is one of Boris's big initiatives, has a wellbeing mission within it, and that is twofold. One is to look at how to improve policies in a wide range of important areas to better address wellbeing, but the second element of the wellbeing measure is to assess the impact of all the other policies in this Levelling Up initiative. So that again should be a sort of foundation stone set by politicians on how to measure the importance of the way forward. So all of these are steps in the right direction and completely supports Gus's view. We will get there. As civil servants, we really want to get wellbeing and to work with wellbeing and to use it as we go forwards. So encouraging, but lots more to be done. And we very much want to work with you as academics to use your work to embed that in policy and make it work better. And if you've got things that you've worked on that you'd like to have promoted, do come and catch me later on during the day, because I'd love to work with you on that.
There's huge interest and motivation across the government analysts in government, and actually that motivation that people take wellbeing with them from job to job, which is Amanda has done, actually as Liz has done as well. You take this with you, you're hugely motivated, but that motivation is great if you know your behavioural science, but you also need capability, which is what this allows you to do, and opportunity, which is what you've got. This measures there, and it's in the system, it's able to do it, it's easy to do, it's timely to do. And actually that decision making about the right time and the place. So decisions get made. You've got evidence, you've got politics and democracy, you've got delivery. Decisions get made. And you need the right evidence at the right time, but you also need a sort of a practical sort of background about what is it you're prioritising at that time, so you can make those rapid decisions. It's like a spotlight of fast policy. And what we're talking about is much more the slow policy making that's underpinned by fantastic data. So we've already had amazing data released today. Thank you so much. Liz, do you want to tell us a little bit about the data, where it is, how it's being used?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. At ONS, our central mission is statistics for the public good, and it's all about making sure the public are well informed and decision makers, be they, and we've heard all the different sectors who might use the data, be they in the private sector, public sector, civil society, have access to the right information at the right time to make the decisions. And that's very true of wellbeing data as it's true of all of our data. And I guess picking up some of the threads we've been hearing about so far, making sure people have that data at the right time is absolutely crucial. So yeah, we have published data this morning, part of our fortnightly release of wellbeing data. And during the height of the pandemic, we started producing wellbeing data every week. And I think that was really important. And that was part of the data that we handed directly to the Cabinet Office, alongside other crucial data that we have in ONS that was informing the pandemic, from the infection survey to economic data. But we were saying, actually, we need to look at the impact of the pandemic in the round, and well-being is a really vital part of that. And there's no point us giving you data in a quarter's time or a year's time, because decisions are being made at much, much quicker a time scale than that. And I think that sort of timeliness of data, plus the actually putting the data in the hands of the people who are making decisions, is absolutely vital. And then doing not just providing data, but providing the insights. How is the pandemic affecting people's well-being? How is it affecting different groups in society's well-being, different people in the country's well-being? What different factors are affecting their well-being? How does it link to social capital, to loneliness, to anxiety? And giving that full picture to policymakers who are making, for example, decisions on bubbling policy, and so that you actually had the data at the right time to inform that was, I think, absolutely vital. And I think shows the sort of power data can have in some of that decision making. So that was a really important emphasis for us, I think, during the last couple of years in relation to wellbeing data. We've talked about the long background of building up the data and the approaches, but the switch, I think, in those 2 years was actually, how can we make sure this is relevant to the challenges the country is facing right now? We need to produce this data more rapidly, and we need to build up the right relationship with decision makers. And so for us, it was really important that we had good relationships with those in the Cabinet Office who were making decisions, so they could get the data they needed at the time to make those decisions. So I guess that's a kind of looking backwards to the last 2 years. And where we are now is looking forward. Where does our approach to wellbeing data evolve from here, and what's next? And I think an important thing for us as we've been thinking about this is, how are we thinking about progress in the UK in as broad terms as we possibly can? And Gus spoke about the limitations of GDP, which I will not rehearse here. But GDP fine as a measure of economic welfare, not fine if you're wanting a comprehensive look at the progress a country is in. So one of the things we are wanting to do is be able to provide the public and policymakers with the chance to look, when GDP is released, not just at GDP, but also at measures of well-being and also at measures of climate change and how the environment is being impacted. So at the last quarterly GDP release in May, we produced a quarterly climate insights publication for the first time, which we published alongside GDP. And in August, we will do the same with well-being. So we're taking the opportunity to update our measuring national wellbeing framework, which hasn't been the emphasis of the last couple of years, where we've been focusing really on getting that timely data through the pandemic. So we're going to update that in August, publish it alongside GDP and alongside our climate publication, and begin to allow people to look at those measures of progress in the round each quarter, which I think will be important and powerful. And at the same time in August, we want to take that step back and say, actually, it's been 10 years since we released over 10 years, since we released the Measuring National Wellbeing Framework. Is this still, are the measures that we are measuring within it still capturing everything that we need to think about for an evolving and changing country now? And we hope as we do that, that the insights of everyone in this room will feed into that, so that we can make sure that we are carrying on collecting the right data that's going to help decision makers, that's robust, that's informed, that's produced at the right frequency, and I think also importantly at the right granularity. I mean, we've heard about the Levelling Up mission, but we know that people want to know what's happening in their local area, that data speaks to them at a local area in a way that it doesn't always speak to them at a national area. So the granularity and the timeliness are important aspects of that as well. So more to come from us in August, and I hope at that point more engagement from all of you with our data and statistics as well, because the insights of people in this room continue to shape how we approach wellbeing data. Thank you.
Liz, thank you. It's actually really exciting. We've obviously focused the last 2 years on subjective wellbeing data, because that's been very, I have to say, I didn't think it would move as much as it has, really moved. But going back again actually to a much broader picture essentially of our national accounts, where we have, yes, the blue book with the economic data, but we've also got social data, which is in the wellbeing framework really broadly across 10 domains of our life, and the environmental together in one place. So we finish this job of, get towards finishing this job of national accounts being full things. Joe, we've talked a lot about language in this, and you've been trying to get fuller metrics in there, but also just trying to get it into a manifesto, get it talking to politicians. So can we tell you about this slightly weird political economy of this subject?
Yeah, well, I think what's really fascinating is, first of all, there has been a big amount of progress in the last, say, 15 years. So, I remember having a debate on this in Parliament in 2008 with the Treasury, and I remember the Treasury Minister, and this was about, challenges to use of GDP as a measure and, other ways of thinking about quality of life. And Angela Eagle, as Treasury Minister, she had this kind of brief from her officials, which was obviously like the Treasury line that she sort of quietly put to one side, and then, spoke as an economist talking about, yeah, actually GDP doesn't capture everything, and she talked about as a feminist how, all of the uncaptured work that isn't in the data. And so I think, but then it was very fringe. People kind of looked at you like you were a bit mad for raising it, and if they were interested at all. And now we have these regular statistics, and I think debate is starting to shift, but I wouldn't overemphasize that, right? So there's some big picture stuff, right? Jacinda Ardern's wellbeing budget, Nicola Sturgeon's TED Talk on wellbeing. David Cameron was mentioned. He may not have been the kind of strongest sort of true believer, but that said, he did take a lot of flack. I mean, you can imagine what the Daily Mail thought about the idea of measuring happiness back in 2010, and he rode that through and still put his name to it, which I do remember at the time actually feeling very appreciative that he was prepared to take that flack, because this well-being word does have that slightly fluffy kind of connotation. And I think we're in a strange place that we sort of expect that politics will be better if it's just about statistics and numbers and growth and kind of in a really kind of almost kind of macho culture. I remember one of the best meetings that we had in the all-party Wellbeing Economics group, where Oliver Letwin, a Conservative MP, was talking, and he was talking about love and about beauty. I mean, these are concepts that are not normally talked about in political debate, but if you actually ask people what matters to them, it's their friends and their family, their loved ones, and perhaps the pandemic has helped us as a country, and indeed also from a government perspective, to focus on that a little bit more strongly. And I think the bubbling policy that you mentioned, Liz, was such a good example of this. You know, we had this lockdown, it was all for very good kind of scientific evidence-based reasons. There was a lot of uncertainty, so there was a sort of safety first, cautious approach. Well, arguably it could have been a bit earlier, but anyway, we had that approach. But I mean, you know, my mum's on her own, my dad died a few years ago, and actually that first 3 months where she didn't touch another human being. You know, my sister's just a few miles down the road, but she couldn't see her grandchildren even though they were close by. And when the bubbling policy came in, I mean, it was just literally transformational on that basis of loneliness. And of course, for a very, very minor kind of raise in the risk level. So, you know, that's something which I think politics got right fairly quickly, but is the kind of thing that could have easily been not understood or missed. And actually interesting, the differences between the nations, because Scotland had a more permissive approach, for example, for children. So it was, you know, my mum's in Scotland, she was able to, you know, hug her grandchildren more quickly than my mother-in-law in England was able to hug her grandchildren. So it was a really kind of interesting example. But I think the other thing is the public don't really talk about well-being. You know, I've knocked on, you know, thousands and thousands of doors in my time, and people don't really talk about their well-being. But they talk about the issue just using different words. I mean, everything in politics is really about that. And I think one of the fundamental problems is that we have almost, you know, in political kind of media commentary, make the assumption that GDP is a proxy for what people want. Isn't factoring in the environmental issues, which particularly the younger generation will tell us are causing them significant anxiety and worry about the future, and arguably are still not properly reflected in the political debates. So, I mean, I think Gus was absolutely spot on when he said, you know, you can tweak GDP, and it clearly probably could be made better. But if you don't actually tackle head on the fact that, you know, GDP growth, even if it was better calculated, isn't actually going to deliver us the well-being that we want. You know, if you focus on that as one thing, it you know, it isn't going to do it. We actually have to be a bit braver and say, you know, growth in the economy does not automatically equate to a higher well-being society.
Really quite widely, and it's a very different channel to our statistical bulletin, which is inevitably gets picked up more by expert users. We also find using different data visualizations can be really impactful as well. Particularly, we find ones that allow people to zoom in on what's happening in their local area. That particularly gets traction with a wider audience because people care about where they live and what the data shows about them. So I think you've got to look at it in a sort of pretty multifaceted approach. Use different channels, build relationships with media organizations, and I think also think creatively. Where are people looking at information, and is your information there, not just kind of having the publication on your website?
I mean, I love this question because it also goes to the heart of what the challenge is politically. You know, how as a politician do you do the Newsnight interview on the well-being figures without being ridiculed by the economics editor of the BBC, by various commentators? I mean, that's kind of the crux of the challenge. And I think part of this is because the whole economics discipline is currently fairly narrow, quite dogmatic. I mean, if you look at the top economics journals, very difficult to get published in. I mean, there's lots of things that they are really not looking at in the detail that they should be, whether it's environmental, whether it's social. I think that will be changing. There are, you know, increasing, particularly, you know, newer economists coming through who are really challenging that sort of old view of things. Because this is, I mean, Liz's points were absolutely right about making sure that people can understand it locally, but it's also about a broader view of the world. It's about the fact that what matters is much more than, you know, one figure. And it goes to the point about, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. We have to monetize things. We have to value things. We have to work within the system that exists to be able to make the case. But we also need to not take our eye off the fact that we ultimately want to imagine a society where we can think in a little bit more complexity about understanding the things that matter and the different trade-offs and judgments that need to be made. And you know, which actually instinctively we all do in our everyday lives, right? right? We're actually used to doing that. And it's time the public debate caught up with that rather than trying to distill everything down into some kind of single figure or single soundbite. And sadly, the media environment is probably not going in the right direction of that at the moment, particularly with 280 characters, very short TikTok videos. This is how consumption is going. But I think we need to try to find space for events like this where you can have a much more thoughtful debate because that's the way we're going to get more progress.
Thank you so much. I have to say the commute data is always the one that everybody loves, gets everybody chatting. And actually the occupation data is another one. I know there's one more question, but I've been told that we need to finish. So I need to get you coffee before you get to your workshop. So the panel are around for, I think, the rest of the day. So please do come and speak to them. They've got huge amounts of knowledge and experience and would love to hear from you. So this is about language, leadership and learning, and I think they can do it. So thank you very much, Joe, Liz, Amanda and Sarah for joining us today.
This is a panel that I myself and many others in the centre and in the field have been looking forward to for quite some time, and it should build really nicely, I think, on the previous panel. We've got three giants with us that have each contributed tremendously to thinking and actually moving beyond GDP and putting well-being at the heart of policy. But I do feel that this is a unique opportunity also to dig a bit deeper about what we actually mean, more precisely so, with well-being, and what well-being or measures should be and can be the ultimate criterion to build policy on, the key performance indicator, if you will. Because that is ultimately what policymakers need. They need something to optimize on. And what measure of well-being or what measures of well-being is a deep and important debate. Paul and Richard have forcefully argued over the years, for many years now, for subjective well-being measures of the kind that we've been hearing a lot about already, whether they are effective or evaluative. But both have taken somewhat different takes on this aspect of to use effective or evaluative measures as the key criterion or the proper criterion to use for policy. Diane, I think, will help us take a step back and consider whether subjective well-being measures are up to the job in the first place, perhaps, or whether a multidimensional mix of indicators is potentially better. And so my hope is for this panel of grandees in the Beyond GDP movement to hopefully come to a very open, you too, Paul, to have an open, potentially critical, but constructively critical discussion around the use of specific measures to take us beyond GDP and measures that capture well-being properly, and how and which ones are best fit for purpose from a policymaker's perspective. I will start with Diane, who is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at Cambridge University, the other university, where she co-directs the Bennett Institute. Diane is a towering figure, as I said, in the Beyond GDP movement, and she, as you will all know, has written many books on the subject, probably the best books on the subject of both the shortcomings of GDP and what can be done to improve on it. She has also held a number of really important roles in policy, and I think that really makes Diane a person ideal to kick us off with, to talk about well-being and policy and what measures are the most user-friendly. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you for the introduction. I've never been called a grandee before, so that's great. And it's really wonderful to be here with so many friends and colleagues and old debating partners as well. So as Jan said, I came to this subject through the Beyond GDP debate, and it probably started in the early 2000s. Getting into that discussion about the limitations of GDP, which are very well known, and the consequent question, which is if that's limited as your metric of progress, then what is a better metric of progress? What should you be thinking about? And this came about, I think, partly because in the 1950s and the 60s and 70s, GDP was a much better proxy for economic welfare than it has become subsequently for all kinds of reasons. And so the debate is, as Gus said in his introduction, do you try to tweak GDP and make it better? It was always actually a semi-economic welfare measure, but it's got worse and worse, so can we improve it again? Do you think about a new single index? And some of those are very long-standing. The Human Development Index, for instance, is one, and there are newer ones, Happy Planet Index. Tobin and Nordhaus did one in the 1970s, measure of economic welfare. Or do you instead try to think about a dashboard of metrics, and if so, what should go into that dashboard? And the Sen, Stiglitz and Fitoussi Commission that was published in 2009 came down on the side of a dashboard. And there's probably been what I would call a proliferation of dashboards since then, culminating in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are all very worthy and the subject of a very intense debate about what should go in there. But they ended up with nearly 300 metrics and no framework for thinking about the trade-offs between them, still less actually measuring them across many different countries. So there's really a fundamental dilemma here. Do we want one number or do we want many numbers? And I've been very influenced by Amartya Sen's and Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach, which is multidimensional, that you can't compress all of the things that we care about into a single number. And in my policy roles as well, applying public value tests in the context of BBC services, that again, doesn't boil it down to a single number. It's a framework for making a judgment given a series of numbers and a series of indicators. But there is, I think, just a really fundamental dilemma that Elizabeth Anderson described very well in her book, Values in Ethics and Economics, which is that we know there are multiple dimensions that we care about, but when you're coming to policy choices, there's a choice. It's got to be a go or a no-go. And so how do we resolve this dilemma? And I see this playing out a little bit in well-being policy. In the previous panel, Liz was talking about the very welcome moves by ONS to publish environmental indicators and now well-being indicators alongside GDP numbers. And indeed, John Hicks used to call it the social framework. It wasn't GDP, it wasn't even national accounts, it was the social framework. So we think about that, but we've got to rely on some kind of reduction to actually make policy decisions. Given where I come from philosophically on this, I welcome the wellbeing agenda as a means of making policy less reductive and expanding that dimensionality and bringing back the role of judgment and normative criteria in thinking about economic policy decisions. But I think there are lots of questions, and especially outside a room like this where we are all talking to like-minded people. So Sarah talked about the Green Book driving demand for wellbeing evidence. It's driving demand because it's the Green Book. I think it's more that than a fundamental upsurge in interest in wellbeing evidence, although perhaps that's there too. But I think we've still got to answer some questions. And I just want to end, if I may, by flagging up what I think are some really important areas for both policymakers and researchers to take away to think about. One is the question about individual versus collective. Some colleagues of mine on a project that we did working with Nancy and her colleagues looked at the link between life satisfaction and education. And in the data set and for the period that we had the data, there was a negative correlation for individuals between life satisfaction and educational attainment, but a positive correlation between individual well-being and the a proportion of people with qualifications living in their area. So that's one example. I don't know if it's robust across different times and different places, but that question about individual versus collective seems to me to be one that needs exploring more. Gus talked about well-being mobility. There are lots of interesting questions, it seems to me, about the link between the econometric evidence that we have and underlying psychological theories and some hypothesis testing to be done so that we know whether in that database of coefficients we've got structural coefficients or reduced form coefficients. So how robust are they over time and across places? And I'm about to start with my colleague Gordon Harold in Cambridge, a big project looking at mental well-being in the workplace and how that is linked to individuals' transitions among their different jobs into the workplace in the first place, and how that relates to more conventional economic measures like productivity and profits. So we think there are lots of interesting questions there. And I'd also like to see more co-production. My former colleague Mark Fabian, who's here today, was the leader of a project co-producing well-being outcome measures for people who had fallen into poverty and approached a charity called Turn to Us. And I think the lesson I took from that was that the ONS4 are great, but in many contexts, they don't give you the full picture. And let's think about some of the other indicators that might emerge from that kind of very bottom-up work, not focus groups, not surveys, but co-production. And in particular, that we've discussed the civil sector today, the third sector. I think there's a fourth sector, and that's what happens inside households and household production and children, which came up in the last section too. So loads of questions, a lot of very valuable work going on, but as somebody who has engaged in policy, I still think there's lots of work for researchers to do, and I would plead for maintaining that multidimensionality and not being too reductive in wellbeing policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Richard, I need to introduce Richard, but then does he really need an introduction? He's an emeritus professor of economics at the London School of Economics, where he founded the Centre for Economic Performance, where he still leads the Wellbeing Programme. He's a member of the House of Lords and has weighed in on important policy debates over the years. He's known for his best-selling books and being a founding editor, co-editor of the World Happiness Report, co-founder of Action for Happiness, and of the World Wellbeing Movement, which gets launched this afternoon. And Rich is obviously co-organizing this conference, and I'm so very pleased to hand the floor to him.
Well, as Diane said, this is the second time we've done this. And I think I've been told I've got 6 minutes, so I've got 6 points. So the first point is the essential need for an overarching criterion. Because if you have a dashboard and you're trying to choose between two alternatives, and one is better on one bit of the dashboard and one is better on the other, you've got to have some idea about how important the different elements in the dashboard are. Where do you get that idea from? It's got to come from some estimate of how they contribute to the one thing which is really important. And unless you have an overarching concept, you can't really have a system of coherent decisions. As you said, science stops when you've calculated the outcome in terms of dashboards, and then you get judgment, and there's no scientific way of carrying the discussion forward. So if you need an overarching criterion to weight the dashboards, why not just use the overarching criterion as the thing you're focusing on? But what should that be, second? The argument that has always impressed me is this, that there are many goods. I mean, they might be in the dashboard. You know, there's wealth, there's health, freedom, and so on. And you can ask people, why is that good? And they can give some sort of answer. They'll say, well, health is important. You feel awful if you're sick. Wealth is important. You feel better if you can do more things. But if you ask, why does it matter how people feel? You can't give an answer. I mean, that's the end of the tracks. That's the thing which is self-evident. And that's why that is the right concept of the overarching criterion. Then there's a question of how to measure that. Probably our debate. And the two basic ways are obviously to ask people how they feel about their life nowadays. We've had this discussion yesterday, so I'll just be quick. How do they feel about their life nowadays is the life satisfaction approach. And the other is, how do they feel? Period. How are they feeling at this moment, that moment, cumulatively through time, which is the hedonic approach. I think that for most purposes, but not all, we should certainly start from the life satisfaction approach. I'll just give 3 reasons. Danny gave very interesting reflections on this yesterday. But first, I think there's a simple cheapness. I mean, if you can get a lot of information about a person's underlying state over a period of time from one question, that is a terrific advantage. Not only that, but the public can understand what the question is. And they can answer it. Incidentally, these answers that they give to these questions are very quick in these questionnaires. Life satisfaction question is answered really quickly. People know. They know how they feel, and they know what the question means, and they would not be surprised to find it being used to analyse policy. Second, looking at it from the policymaker's point of view. And policymakers have actually for years been asking people, how satisfied are you with your swimming pools, with your roads, etc., with your garbage? It's not so far to go from that. Or how satisfied are you with your life as a whole? So that is why this approach appeals to policymakers, and we should, of course, want to do that if we possibly could. And then third, there are all the arguments that Danny brought up yesterday. How much weight do people give to their recollections of things? I would put it a bit more, how much weight do they give to really their underlying state of mind? Just kind of the baseline. Of course, they're going up and down all the time during the day, according to what they're doing. Very interesting, should influence, obviously, what they make choices of. But the real thing is the underlying state of mind. Of course, we're very interested in, do we want people to take more exercise or all sorts of things, experiences, should we be putting on the Olympic Games, and so on. And, you know, we're not going to pick up the influence of that by asking people before and after the Olympic Games how satisfied they are with their lives. We've got to find out exactly how it affects their hedonic experience. But then we obviously have to have some set of coefficients for, in the end, converting the hedonic into the life satisfaction so that we can get a single overarching measure at the end of the day. I've not mentioned, this is my fourth point, the Aristotelian approach. There are quite a lot of people, Augustus isn't here now, but probably quite a few people in this room who like to think of themselves as Aristotelians. It actually sounds rather good, doesn't it? It sounds sort of wiser than saying we want people to feel good about their lives. Somehow, eudaimonia, I mean, that sounds really good. I mean, it actually appeals to people for different reasons. Some people it appeals to because they think people should feel good about what they're doing. Well, that's not so different from feeling good about your life, to be perfectly honest, which is one reason why their answers are highly correlated. But I think actually the people, I think probably cover Gus, who like to use the Aristotelian approach is because it includes virtue. Now, I think that's a confusion of means with ends. And virtue is, of course, incredibly important. That's what we most want, because virtue means helping to create happiness for other people. So I won't go on about this anymore, because there's a forthcoming article in the World Happiness Report 2023 on this subject. But I don't think that's a helpful contender in terms of the final outcomes. It's more of a discussion of how do we get there. Of course, we want people to be great-hearted and virtuous and all those things. I think I've got two more points, yes. So, the outcome is life satisfaction. How would we therefore analyse all the different policies coming into the Treasury or whatever the decision maker is? We should obviously judge them by the amount of well-being which they generate per pound of expenditure. And this is a huge challenge to us researchers, to generate the information base which would make that possible. I remember the excitement 30 years ago. Tony Atkinson at LSE did a model which would show how a change in government policy would influence the distribution of income. We need a model now which shows how a change in government policy will change the distribution of well-being, and then evaluate that against the cost, make that the centre of cost effectiveness analysis. But the research base is really important, and we're always hoping somebody would come forward and make a large-scale attack on this problem possible. So my last point, sustainability, very important, and social justice, just a word on each. Of course, all policies have effects over time. So both the outcome, the well-being outcome, and the costs have to be estimated over time and then collected together into a single number, each of them. The well-being approach says, I think, that everybody is equally important, wherever they live, wherever they live, but in this case, whenever they live. And that is really the reason why we should be pursuing sustainability, because we care about future generations as much as ourselves, or almost as much. We're not quite sure about the future, so we have to have some small discount rate, but not the kind of discount rate that's typically used in economic analysis. So I think it's no accident that the well-being fraternity and the sustainability fraternity have a massive overlap, because there's a huge common element which is a philosophy which says that people matter in the future just about as much as now. Social justice. I agree with Danny that relief of misery is more important than the extension of substantial happiness of by the same amount. And I think that this is an issue, that has to be left in the end to the judgment of the policymaker. And some people will be more concerned with eliminating misery than others. We can do it numerically. If they tell us what their weights are, we can apply their weights to changes in well-being starting from different points. And that's really what we have to do. People talk as though this is a problem for the well-being approach. I mean, this is a problem for life. It's a problem for every single approach. This has nothing to do with an argument against the well-being approach. We've got to find a way of incorporating the policymakers' distributional judgments. That has to be done with any known approach. So just in conclusion, it seems to me that the case for the well-being approach is not that we know exactly how to do everything and that there are no problems. Of course there are problems. The case for it is that there are less problems than with any other approach. That seems to me, we should be humble, that's how we should make the case. If people are criticising this approach, don't let's say it's easy, but do let's say, you tell me your approach and show me that it's easier.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Paul, over to you. For those, Paul also needs very little introduction. He's a professor of behavioural science at the London School of Economics, where he founded the Department of Behavioural and Psychological Science. He was one of the driving forces way back already behind quality adjusted life years, and the 4 ONS measures in which he had a hand as well. You might also know him from his popular books on happiness, and especially the bestseller Happiness by Design. Paul, your take on subjective well-being as a criterion?
Yeah, thank you, Jan. So, first of all, I just want to say a few high-level contextual points, which is that we're all broadly in agreement that we should be measuring subjective well-being, and that we should be doing that in a way to inform policy decisions, and ideally with a single index measure. And I think that's important when we're having discussions with policymakers and with the outside world, we're all very much aligned. It was like a family. On the outside, we'll be united. Now I feel like a family where I've got all the siblings in the room who all favour one measure, even Danny, who used to be on my side, the traitor, and now I feel lonely and isolated as being the only family member, by and large, who would make a case for using experiential measures. But I do want to make that really important point at the start, though, which is that actually, much of the time, it won't matter. Much of the time, for the purposes of informing policy decisions, life satisfaction and experiential measures will be aligned. And for the purposes of us having discussions with the policymakers, the first order condition is for us to get them to take subjective wellbeing measures more seriously. So, having said all of that, I'm now going to feel very lonely. And I'm look, you're sitting there with your arms folded right in front of me, Danny, making me very nervous. So, what I thought I might do is frame it in a way that you can't possibly argue with, and that's make it about me. So I'll make it about my personal experiences. And in the start of Happiness by Design, which you mentioned, I talk a lot about having had a stammer, and I still have one. It doesn't manifest itself very often now, but it was debilitating. I can't impress upon you how awful an experience as a young boy, as a young adult, stammering was for me. Every time I had to do public speaking, I say my name even, saying my name, Paul Dolan. I can remember as a 12-year-old boy, I don't know, a 14-year-old boy or something, saying my name over and over and over again, thousands of times in order to be able to say it without stammering. Now, if you ask me a life sat question, my life satisfaction throughout all of my childhood, all of my early life, always is, been pretty high. Always about an 8 or 9 out of 10. You shouldn't trust a 10 out of 10s. But my affective states were pretty miserable much of the time. And it seems to me that when they come apart, when life satisfaction, this is what I really want to focus on, when they come apart, not when they align, but when life satisfaction and experiences come apart, where should the policy interventions be directed? That for me is the question. That's the important framing of the question. And I'd like you all to think about that. No one has the answer to that question, but I think the answer to that question is that we would be focusing on misery. And I've heard misery mentioned, I've heard feelings mentioned. That is the essence of our lives. They are the essence of our lives, how we feel, the things that we pay attention to as we go about our lives. Now, of course, life satisfaction measures draw attention to something when you answer them. Actually, not very much, frankly, because people answer them in, 2 seconds, so probably not very much that they're thinking about. But insofar as they are thinking about anything, the question is, are they thinking about what they're going to be paying attention to in the experiences of their lives that really matter as they live and breathe those lives? And sometimes they will, but oftentimes they won't. And I'll tell you just a quick story about someone else that many of you would have read in Happiness by Design, because it was the one story that actually many people picked up on. It was the story of my wife's best friend who worked for a broadcasting corporation in the UK with 3 letters. And we went for dinner, and she spent the whole of the evening complaining about every single aspect of her experience on the job. Her colleagues, her boss, her commute, everything about it was miserable. And then she stood up at the end of dinner, and without any hint of irony said, "You know, I love working at the Media Land." And she wasn't lying. What she was doing was drawing on different conceptions of her own happiness. The story that she was telling herself about working there was that she was happy. It's somewhere she'd always wanted to work. Her parents were proud. Her friends were jealous. She was satisfying a lot of her desires, and she was maximising, to some degree, life satisfaction. But she was fucking miserable. So I would contend, normatively, she's made a mistake. And actually, as I was making the point yesterday, partly what motivated me to get into this kind of area of work was the fact that the standard preference-based measures of measuring welfare were a poor guide to policy because people are not very good at being able to predict their future well-being. And in some ways, to some degree, life satisfaction measures are like that. They allow people to express the degree to which they're satisfied with their preferences even, and it's at least worth us inquiring properly and fully and robustly into the experiences that people have, particularly when they come apart. And for the purposes of guiding policy decisions, I would be arguing for minimising suffering as people live and breathe and experience it, and not as they evaluate it.
Thank you, Paul. Wow. this panel has already lived up to the high expectations and well beyond them so far. Quick follow-up on what Paul just said. Richard, how do you marry those instances where the experience does not necessarily match the evaluation of it? So Paul's wife's friend who works at Medialand with 3 letters, how would you take that into account if policy making needs to be done?
I think this goes back exactly to what Danny was saying. So, most people are least happy when they're working. But people without work are very unhappy. Mm-hmm. So what's work doing for people? I mean, don't you? I feel good when I've finished my work. Not while I'm working, I feel good when I've finished it. I've done it. So this is the problem, that so much of what you do influences your mood at other times from when you're doing it. This is the fundamental difficulty in this time use way of going at it, rather than trying to find out what is determining the person's sort of base level feeling. Of course, it goes over into their working time as well as other, but work influences. I mean, more of your life is not working than working. Your work has more of an influence in total utils on how you feel in your non-work time than it does in your work time. So this is why I think, and you know, the emphasis you've given to purpose, which is also there, is very important. The purpose is something that's kind of always with you, whatever you're doing, and I think it's you pick it up quite well in the life satisfaction question, and there's actually quite a lot of feeling in the way people answer life satisfaction, and we call it life evaluation. That sounds very cerebral, but it's actually more a better way of describing how do you feel about your life, which is the sort of feeling.
Yeah, no, just again, just to say what I said at the beginning, because I think that's really important. Much of the time the measures will align, and especially in work, people that will often have high life satisfaction in work will also have good experiences in work. But it is, as you absolutely rightly say, it's important to draw attention to experiences of purpose alongside those of pleasure. And of course, that's where many people get most of their purposes through work. But it does then lead us into considerations of where the interventions will be directed to have the most effect. And many of you that will know the worker wellbeing literature better than I do, generally speaking, pleasure-based activities are not, or interventions are not ones that are particularly good for worker wellbeing, but purpose-based ones are. And so understanding that distinction in the experiences that people have in work is fundamentally important. And the life satisfaction measures will again potentially combine or even conflate pleasure and purpose in ways that are not useful for people in workplaces thinking about interventions.
From a pragmatic perspective, you do want policymakers to have a criterion and not have to measure pleasure, purpose, or some weighted average between them, and it doesn't. Life satisfaction captures both to some extent.
Answer the multidimensionality point.
I would disagree with that, and this is a rerun of the debate we've had for a long time. I don't think you need an overarching criterion, actually. And let me talk about the way we reach these decisions in the context of BBC services. I will say the 3 letters. There was a framework, it was called Public Value Test, and it had 4 criteria. So it was a 4-item dashboard. How many people would use the service, what's the cost efficiency of it, what's the technical quality of it, and what's the impact likely to be in terms of its stated aim. And we would set out the evidence and actually reach a judgment on that framework. There was no need at all to boil it down to a single overarching criterion. And I think that role for judgment is important because you won't always want to weight things together in the same way. And there are things that we would care about that may be completely incommensurable. So a sense of identity or cultural identification or pride in place is a different kind of beast from the satisfaction that you get from everyday life and your life and work. So I wouldn't want to reduce those. Sense of purpose, another example. And the final thing to add is I would say that from what I've seen, agency or control seems to be important, and that isn't an outcome, it's about the process. And do you want to collapse that into how people feel in terms of either measure of life satisfaction or evaluation? I think not. I think it's just a different kind of criterion, and we should allow judgment.
Diane, allow me to push back a little bit. Take your own example, the BBC, 4 dimensions or 4 outcomes that you're measuring that are really critical in a dashboard approach. If you're the CEO of the BBC and you have a limited budget, say 100 million to spend, how do you decide which of these 4 to invest in? Do you then invest 25 million in each one of these 4 dimensions? Because you don't have a criterion to optimize on, so you wouldn't necessarily know the relative importance of these 4 dimensions in driving the whole outcome of which there's no measure.
Well, then you see how they tally against your strategic aims, which in the BBC's case is set out in the Charter. This was the revision to the Green Book a couple of years ago. The evaluation criteria did not change. It was still the same cost-benefit analysis, taking in wider welfare effects, taking in well-being effects, but an additional consideration would be to what extent did the outcome of the exercise tie in with the government's overarching ambition to level up the economy. It might not be economically efficient to level up the economy.
But what you just said, is that not referring to implicitly a criterion? The overarching ambition of the government is your criterion on which to base your spending across the
but that's judgmental, and a different government can have a different one.
Okay.
Sorry, could I just... The Green Book now says social well-being is the objective. In practice, most of it is to be evaluated in monetary units based on revealed preference, but they're now allowing for the use, somebody else will be saying this later, they're allowing for the use of direct measures and showing how that can be done. But I mean, so that, of course, has an overarching criterion. And why that's so important is, I mean, David and I have spent, I don't know how long now, God knows, nearly 18 years, trying to get more money for mental health. And we're told there isn't money. Well, there is money. Where is it going? Where is this money going at the moment? Under the previous Prime Minister, if we have to call him, it's going into physical infrastructure, building roads, building railways. I mean, if we want a serious argument about getting the right kind of things that you would support for mental health, we've got to be able to say what's going to be less of, as well as what's going to be more of. And we've got to be able to do that on a single criterion. So, I mean, that's why we can't just minimise misery, because there must be some reason why we have a transport system for the lives of ordinary people, and there's some reason why we have an education system for the lives of ordinary people. We've got to be able to balance reasonable levels of expenditure on those things against misery reduction, and that requires some overarching criterion.
You can tell this panel is very passionate about these elements and has eaten up in quite a bit of time, but we should try and get at least 1 or 2 questions from the audience, expert audience, I should say, in. Nick.
Actually, you can stop there.
Sorry.
Okay, that works now. I think part of this is a marketing issue as well as a measurement issue. I mean, John, you called it the World Happiness Report. You don't call it the World Life Satisfaction Report. Satisfaction is a really dull word to go to the public with. It's not inspiring. You know, care that Joe talked about this morning. Suddenly people start to rise when we start using emotional words in this space. You talk about happiness, and now I don't think the Cantrell ladder of life is necessarily happiness. It doesn't feel affect-based. And so there's the measurement issues, but there's also, if we really want to make a public movement about this, we need the vision thing. We need the vision thing, and I think that we need words that have got more emotion in them. And I don't know, that's what I'd say. I mean, that's why I called it the Happy Planet Index. My first name for it was Sustainable Wellbeing Index. Luckily, someone got hold of me and went, call it the Happy Planet. There's no way it would have been as successful if it been called the Sustainable Wellbeing Index. So it's partly about marketing. I just want to point that out there, that we're going to persuade people.
Mm-hmm. Mark.
Mostly Diane's comments about whether we need single criteria, maybe sort of at the end of the day, but what about kind of in a more day-to-day way in public policy? So I work a lot in the social services area, in multiple complex disadvantage. This is like a multi-decade running problem, super hard to solve, and usually you make kind of very small incremental steps that feel like you're moving in the right direction, but almost every policy fails. And so what we're trying to do is learn things about very many issues that we might be interested in, like how does mental health relate to drug abuse, relate to housing, relate to whatever, and we're trying to collect information on all these different things. If we base our decisions about which of these social projects is most effective in terms of a final outcome, then we don't learn very much about the process that is achieving that final outcome. And I wonder if there's any worries that in focusing on one key overarching variable, we fail to collect all this other information that we need to understand the causation to get to that final variable.
Can I build on Mark's point and perhaps also conclude with a consensus proposal, or at least to get your feedback on it? The OECD has a Better Lives Index. It's 11 dimensions. Most of you will be very familiar with it. There's 10 dimensions that are your traditional drivers, pathways to, causal avenues towards well-being more generally. And then there's that 11th dimension, which is feeling, subjective well-being. In fact, it uses the Cantrell ladder from the Gallup World Poll, which we use for the World Happiness Report. Is that a step forward from when moving beyond GDP to adopt something like the OECD Better Life Index, have these 11 dimensions, which then allow people with their own tastes and tweaks to either use the 11 dimensions together in an index, which the OECD proposes, or people that prefer the subject well-being as an overarching criterion for a number of reasons, to then leverage that 11th dimension and put it sort of on top in the analysis to have something on the left-hand side of the equation and help be explained by variables on the right hand of the equation that Mark is referring to. So I was wondering, Diane, Richard, Paul, how do you feel about the OECD 11 dimensions that have the subjective element, the objective element, and potentially allow that flexibility for us to move forward?
I'm going to cop out and say I don't think we know enough yet about the causal mechanisms that Mark is referring to make a final decision. So I welcome the Better Life Index, of course, but I don't have a horse in the race. I'm going to cop out.
Richard, how do you feel about the Better Life Index and its potential?
Well, I think it's a step forward, but it's not a big enough step forward, and in some sense, it actually, 11 is not broken down enough. I mean, what bits of education or whatever. But am I allowed to answer Nick's question at the same time?
Go for it, Richard.
I mean, Nick's raised an incredibly important question, and I gather that various people have been discussing this over coffee already. But it is quite an important thing for this group, and the name of this conference is the Wellbeing Conference. We many of us started off with the word happiness. I think you've always used the word happiness. So how did we get to well-being? Well, it was partly this Aristotelian thing that I mentioned before. But it's also extraordinary confusions about language. People think that if you're talking about happiness, it means you're either happy or not happy. They think it's binary. Then they think, well, you can't be happy that much of the time, so it's a ridiculous objective. Somehow they have picked up the idea, because well-being is not really part of the English language, that well-being is a scale, whereas happiness is not a scale. I mean, if we could get people to think of happiness as a scale, we could possibly get back to happiness. And that would be a very much better situation, because happiness is really not frivolous. It is not frivolous to ask somebody if a child is happy at school. It is not frivolous to ask somebody if they are happy at work or if they are happily married. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that we need to conduct this linguistic argument in public.
Thank you. And on behalf of all of us...
Can I get a moment or not? Do I not get to say the final word since we all had a go? Can we have a little go? Because what I was going to do was actually agree wholeheartedly with that, because you have to get the subjective into discourse as a serious metric. It's all subjective is actually the whole point of it.
And
but I was going to say, on your OECD Better Life Index, which was your question to all of us, I'll just remind you of that. Was that I was thinking about two people that I really care about a lot, which are my two teenage children, more than probably anybody else that I care about. Would I want that metric to be used as a way of measuring how well their lives are going? Maybe, but I'd want to know how they're feeling.
And that's why for people like Richard and Paul, the 11th dimension, how they feel, can be put on top.
How they feel, how they feel, not the Cantrell ladder.
I see.
Yeah, let's be clear about that. Let's be absolutely clear about that.
My hope for resolving all these issues after all these years is completely gone up in smoke at this point. But please join me in thanking all three.
Hello, is this working? Can you hear me? Great. Well, hello everyone. So we're going to get on with the next session. So you've heard about research, you've heard about policy, you've heard some philosophical disagreements, and now we're going to be talking about philanthropy. So what role can foundations play? What can we do as individuals if we want to get out our own checkbooks? What can we do with our spare time? So I'm delighted to have a panel of extremely, I think, sort of titans of the foundation world, who are going to be setting out their stall very briefly on what they do, the challenges they face, how they try and get well-being into their grant making and their thinking. So we have Sarah Davidson, who's the CEO of Carnegie UK. We have Dr. Alonso Plough. Do we have Anna? Yes, Anna, sorry. Professor Anna Vaniolas of the Leverhulme Trust, Dr. John Barr, and Miranda Walpert, Director of Mental Health at Wellcome. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to give them any longer introductions than that, but I'm hoping they will tell us what they're about. I should maybe very briefly say who I am. So in this context, I wear two hats. So I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Wellbeing Research Centre, which I think you've now heard of, and there my role is as a philosopher to disagree with other people. That's the only place I'm useful. But I'm also the director of the Happier Lives Institute, which is an organisation I set up and you probably haven't heard of. And what we aim to do is to try and find the most cost-effective, evidence-based ways to improve well-being. So we started with basically two simple ideas. So we're motivated by effective altruism, the idea that we should do good and we should try and do the most good we can. So good is good, more good is better. But also that when we think about doing the most good, we should do this in terms of well-being. So actually focus on happiness, life satisfaction. And so when I've been, when people who are involved in effective altruism and high impact philanthropy, when they think, how do you do the most good? One place lots of people come to, if they're taking a global perspective, is they might say that we can have the most impact by helping those in absolute poverty. So saving lives through anti-malarial bed nets, you could save a child's life for a few $1,000s, providing cash transfers to families living in poverty, treating intestinal worms with tablets, which allow children to go, which allow them to have an education and focus in school. But people thinking in that way had not yet thought, okay, let's do this in terms of well-being. Actually, what are the most effective ways if we think in terms of that? So that's the sort of research we've been doing. So you heard earlier that in the UK Green Book, we try and value a well-be, so one life satisfaction point for 1 year at £13,000. We found that, I was actually just doing the numbers in an earlier session, that if you donated to or gave money to cash transfers to the very poor, that would be 100 times more cost effective in terms of getting your well-be's. And then the other research we've done was comparing that to treating mental illness. So you get people together once a week in a group to talk about their interpersonal challenges, and that is 1,000 times more cost effective. So that's 10 times more cost effective than cash transfers. And so what that shows, we think, is that taking a well-being lens to philanthropy can be really valuable. It can take you in some new places, and we want to go on and kind of compare things more broadly and see what else we can find. So that was my bit, and now I'll hand over to Alonso. Take it away.
This is working? Good, great. Really glad to be here. Alonso Plow at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. But I have to say I'm a very short-term philanthropist, long-time recovering academic, and longer time runner of large public health systems, Los Angeles, Seattle, King County, Washington, Boston. So my perspectives are going to be a weaving together of those life experiences in the context of well-being and the particular work this foundation is trying to do. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, founded 51 years ago by the founder of Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceuticals, independent of that company for 50 years. I always want to make that very clear. So that's who we are, and we're the largest foundation in the United States focused exclusively on health. So, what do foundations do? At our best, we are evidence-driven catalysts to engage in just the most important big social challenges in our societies. And I think that has brought us to thinking about well-being. In the foundation, we have moved from a focus on more traditional health and healthcare to what we call a culture of health and well-being. Meaning that health is largely determined by social context, how you live, many of the kinds of things that are just second nature to the well-being discourse, but not so second nature to the dominant health constructs that drive those healthcare systems. I am here, as I always am when I come over here, in a learning mode. And I'll come back to this a couple of times. We are so far behind in the States in norming well-being at any level, operationalizing it in policy, research, or practice. But I will get, I don't like to keep the last chapter to the end. We're really focused on trying to reverse that, and we have the positional authority in the states to be a catalyst in changing that dynamic. And we've been on a learning journey from from what you've been doing over here, from 2018, a conference that many of you were here attended at Bellagio, at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio, where we published a book in our Oxford System series on the Oxford University Press series on well-being. I refer you to that. It's on our website. And we started the foundation journey into what it means to internalize that. I would also mention that we have a global program, which I call the opposite of American exceptionalism. It's global ideas for U.S. solutions. I have a colleague here from that, Claire. And this is really the key of our learning mode. We have so much to learn around the well-being constructs. So it's really just not very deeply embedded in policy or research. So, and also we do a lot of work, and you would imagine in the U.S. context, a culture of health has to address inequity and inequality in the states that is driven so much by racial inequality. But we believe that the well-being construct can be a unifier in what is often a very divisive dialogue about confronting things like structural racism, unequal health outcomes, and poverty and deprivation related to marginality. So that's how we kind of look at that. So here's our ambitious operational approach to that. We just released a National Commission report called Transforming Public Health Data. And that report and the grant making that follows that up is all about that. How do we fundamentally alter the way that the United States is thinking about health statistics across sectors? And one part of that report, and Gus actually spoke to that advisory committee, and so did Carol, how can we begin to incorporate well-being and positive health metrics into U.S. healthcare data systems? So we are working very closely with CDC, National Institutes of Health. One little kernel into that, we are working to reconstruct and revise behavioral risk factor surveillance system so that it incorporates more robustly these data elements. We're very excited about the traction that report is happening. So that's the top strategy. But we also are thinking about a bottom-up strategy. How can this concept become meaningful and more embedded at local and community levels? And I agree with Gus that the movement part of this, we're interested in improving the metrics, but we're really interested in the movement. That's going to be from the bottom up. And we have a number of projects already where we're working at a neighborhood and community basis around trying to norm the idea of well-being. In the U.S., if you talk about well-being in a community group, they think you're talking about wellness. They think it's a Pilates class, and you have to come, and it's very elite, and you have to overcome that immediately. So we're working at sort of a community level. You'll hear from Sue Polis later on some projects we're doing with the National Leagues of City. We're working in Atlanta. We're going to do a lot more of what is this meaningful indicators of well-being, which may not be called well-being, that can catalyze communities, their local elected leaders, towards something that improves well-being and social cohesion. So just in short, to sum up, we are as interested in refining the measures and metrics as we are interested in meaningful measures and metrics that drive local engagement, and particularly the really difficult challenge of engaging policy decision makers, and we can talk more about that. We think it's going to happen on the ground regionally, just as Gus said, at the level of mayors and councilors, there's a more immediacy and less partisanship, a sense about your government. I've learned a lot today. We'd like to skip over some of the challenges that you have all addressed here, the dashboards that don't sum up. We'd like to work on language that makes this much more accessible, but I think we have an opportunity right now, particularly during this administration, to be a catalyst for this transformation in this country, adopt some of the things that we're learning from you, improve collective action for well-being and maybe even happiness, though that term, the latter one, isn't of wide valence in the U.S. discourse. Thank you.
Great. So you talked about the role of metrics in thinking about health, but which particular metrics are you using, and what's the challenge you face in applying them?
Well, we have used a variety. We have a national set of indicators that we've worked on with RAND that has we call them our national culture of health measures, and we've actually got the OECD number 11 in that. So I don't know if that makes me part of a particular tribe or not, but yeah, we have that there as a starting point. But we're really interested in, I mean, even deeper than subjective indicators, we're really interested in narratives, conversations, stories from people about what they believe improve their lives. So we are doing a lot of work with narrative analysis, storytelling, and trying to develop, I would like to call them indicators that more capture experience directly. That's where we're going on the research side.
Great. So on the topic of research and finding out what improves life, that's a neat segue down it.
Thank you very much. So I'm also a very recently recovered academic and education economist, and I'm so recently recovered that I'm going to use my slot to tell you a little bit about the Leverhulme Trust, but also a little bit where I think there's some research gaps. So the Leverhulme Trust, for those of you who don't know us, we fund Blue Sky's fundamental research. We fund across the disciplines except medicine. And we're interdisciplinary. So on the one hand, we're very suitable for this kind of work, right? Because well-being is the ultimate, I think, in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary problem. But of course, remember the bit where we fund blue skies, right? So we're interested in the fundamentals here rather than necessarily the change in policy at the end of it. But we're also quite an unusual academic funder, I think, because we don't have strong top-down steers, so you can tell me what you'd like to research rather than me necessarily trying to push you in a particular direction. But having said all that, I think there are some really interesting challenges in this space. We've funded a lot of work on the biology of well-being and indeed mental health. On the social science, we understand much more about the very complex drivers of poor well-being, for example. So that's all good. We've also, I think, made some progress, as we hear today, about policy shifting in the right direction, getting the measures right, getting politicians to think about these things in a serious way. So that's good. What I would observe, however, is that there seems to be a space between those two things when it comes to actually making a difference on the ground, the implementation side of things, where there's a lot less evidence, I would argue. So how do we go about making the sort of very complicated system changes that we're going to need to make to bring about changes in well-being? I think we still have an overemphasis on the individual when it comes to interventions. Now, obviously, individual-focused interventions are part of our toolkit, but actually, Diana's point about it being a collective problem is a really important one, and particularly when it comes to systems change, right? You can't do that on individual-by-individual basis. And the scale of some of our low well-being problem is such that we would never be able to scale it up on an individual-by-individual basis. So my first point is we have an implementation gap in the research base. I think the second point is something that has been touched on already, that we're having a lot of discussions, but perhaps not enough focus on children and young people. And I say that because the data on children and young people looked pretty dire before COVID. The well-being has worsened, the anxiety has worsened, so we have a clear issue here. But more than that, if we think low well-being is sticky, and we know that mental health problems that emerge in adolescence lead to long-term problems, we're sort of setting this new generation up for a lifetime of potential difficulty. I mean, not content with economic intergenerational inequalities, we're kind of adding another one on top of that. And I wonder whether or not we've done enough research in that space. And then my third and final point is that I think our go-to institutions to try and resolve some of these issues, to improve the well-being, particularly of children and young people, are just not coping. And it's really interesting coming to conferences where you might hear about the evidence base growing, and it's fantastic and it's well evaluated. And then you go into schools, and schools can't do this, at least not at the level of resourcing that they currently have. And, you know, I heard from Gus earlier about we definitely don't need more exams in the UK education system, but I'm also fairly convinced that abolishing some of those exams in the UK education system is not going to radically transform well-being. It's a more complicated problem than that. And we need to rely on multiple institutions, so health, education, local government, and parents, if we're going to tackle this. And yet, at least from a school's perspective, it feels like a lot is being loaded into that school system. Now, that's a very practical issue that we have, but I actually think it's because we don't understand the implementation science of taking some of our individual interventions, the great evaluations that we've got that something might work, and then figuring out how it's going to work in the wild. You have all these trials, they look promising, the effect size is there, we're optimistic. You take them out into the community, you get no impact, or minimal impact. And I just think as a research community and as funders, we should take that bit of it really seriously. I think it's an area where we could do an awful lot more. And then I'll just end with a point that I know we all know, but it is worth saying, I think, that if the underlying drivers, particularly of low well-being and even mental health problems, are growing, whether that's poverty or loneliness, etc., it's going to be very hard for any of our institutions to hold back that particular tide. And no amount of sort of individual interventions that we hope will improve well-being are really going to tackle it. So again, it's a systems problem from my perspective. So here at the Trust, we let you decide what you want to research. We have a myriad of schemes, from small project grants right through to, years-long fellowships where you can work on this problem in a serious way. So I would welcome applications. I'll stop.
And so you say you don't decide what to fund, but you do decide who to fund. So yes. How do you choose who to fund?
Actually, technically, I don't decide who to fund. Your peers decide whether or not the proposal that you have in front of you is sufficiently rigorous to fund. I think the point about we don't decide to fund is that we're not deciding topics. I think it's legitimate to say we fund on the basis of rigor and good methodology, and even some intent that you're going to make a fundamental shift in the discipline. But the actual topic, no. And I think that's important because I think a lot of the top-down steers may lead people to go in a particular direction. And as I say, there seems to be, to my perspective anyway, this bit of a gap in the bit between policy and individual interventions.
Great. Rhonda, please tell us.
Great. So I'm 3 years into my transformation to be a funder. So I'm fully immersed now. But my background was as a psychologist, as a clinician, and a policy advisor, and then latterly as a bit of an academic. And I still keep a part-time academic post. But I'm very aware of having been sort of a researcher in an audience, listening to a funder, and all you're thinking is, how can I get money out of this person? Which is exactly the appropriate thing to be thinking. And so I suppose I want to say one of the things I'm here to do today is to encourage you to think about us as a potential funder. So I'm representing here the Wellcome Trust, which is the world's second biggest health funder, and in terms of non-government organisations. And I have the great privilege to being Director of Mental Health at the Trust. The Trust is committed to giving away £16 billion over the next 10 years. And we have 4 things that we are giving that money to, one of which is mental health, the other is infectious disease, the other is climate and health, and the 4th is discovery research, broadly defined. And I think to take up your point, we've decided to take a sort of hybrid model. So 3 of those are very much directed. They're mental health, the climate and health, and infectious disease are all about us really thinking hard that these are the key challenges that face the world, and setting challenges to you as a research community to say, this is where we see the bottlenecks, this is where we see the challenges, you come with your great ideas and we will try and fund you, but it's against our strategic aims. And we are very explicit about that, and we have a lot of information on our website, and we have calls specific to those challenges, and I can talk a bit more about those. But I think of particular relevance to you today is our largest funding pot, which is what we broadly call Discovery, which is open to any ideas you have that advance life, health, and crucially well-being. And I think we've just relaunched our schemes. We've simplified them, so we just have 3 schemes which run 3 times a year, and they're divided by the career stage and not by topic or specialism. So we have early career awards, mid-career awards, and what we call the Discovery Awards, which are for settled researchers with large teams. And I guess what we want to be clear about is those awards are open to any discipline, from the humanities through to the biomedical sciences, and they're there for the boldest of ideas that will advance blue skies thinking to understand key topics, such as, for example, measurement and well-being, such as, for example, drivers of well-being. All of those would be relevant topics to be applying for. If you are thinking of applying, I would really encourage you to go bold. We are trying to have bigger awards, longer awards. Those awards are open for up to 8 years, those big Discovery Awards, and we're looking for really bold ideas that people can come with. We have different panels for different awards, but the ultimate decision is with Wellcome, and we are prepared to take risks. And I think that's something that's really important. We are very lucky. Similarly, the money comes originally from pharmaceuticals, but it's been for many, many years now completely independent of any pharmaceutical industry. So we have no living founder, and we are entirely independent. We make our money now on the stock market, and we have done very well over the last few years. So we have money to give away, and the board has very generously committed that 16 billion is there whatever happens, bar something incredibly dramatic. So that is there for us to distribute. You should also be looking at the awards in relation to climate and health, mental health and infection, because there may be elements of well-being that are relevant in all those areas. So I'll just sort of finish with talking a little bit about the specifics of my area, which is mental health. We're focused particularly on anxiety, depression and psychosis. Our broader vision is a world in which no one is held back by mental health problems, and the particular mission for us is to try and create a step change in early intervention to stop these problems becoming lifelong and disabling in the way you were describing. That may mean a focus on research with young people, but it may also mean for some contexts that these things will be discovered later in life, so it's whenever is the earliest possible point for intervention. We have a number of calls open, and we have a number of calls coming up. We are all about trying to create new and improved interventions and greater understanding. We're not about direct service delivery or about service reorganisation.
Great. Well, you heard it there. Put your bids in. Sarah, please tell us about Carnegie.
So thank you very much. As we're talking about recovering, I'm probably a recovering civil servant. I've also been in the foundation sector for 3 years, and while in some ways I feel quite well immersed, as you were describing, Miranda, I also recognise that it's a sector that I'm learning more about all the time, including from panellists here. I think Carnegie UK can legitimately lay claim to being the original wellbeing foundation, certainly in the UK, because Andrew Carnegie used those very specific words when he endowed the foundation way back in 1913 with a mission to improve the well-being of the people of the UK and Ireland. And inevitably over the century and a bit since then, the understanding of what you needed to do to improve well-being has changed and come and gone with time. And as we are in our current incarnation, we're a public policy organisation, so we don't make direct grants. And our interest is in promoting what we call collective well-being. And we define that as everyone having what they need to live well now and in the future. And we talk about a state where, or a situation where democratic, environmental, social and economic well-being outcomes are all held in balance. It's been really interesting to hear other colleagues talking about what's distinctive about foundations in that public policy space, whether it's by funding or by influence. And I think it's really worthwhile to draw some of those out, not least thinking of what Gus O'Donnell had to say earlier about some of the pressures that there are on politicians and the public sector. And one of the assets that foundations have is to be slightly separate from that, and therefore to be able to do things that the public sector, or indeed sometimes the charitable sector, which is dependent on the public sector for funding, can't do. And we try hard to remember that when we're taking the decisions about what we do and thinking about what the space is that we can fill. So I guess our secure financial base, not quite as secure or as large as one is welcome, but nonetheless, compared to many other organisations, relatively secure, means that we can afford to be independent, we can act and speak without fear or favour. As someone mentioned earlier, we can afford to take risks, and a particular bugbear of mine is I don't think that the philanthropic sector exploits that possibility as much as it could, but we certainly are freer, or we should be freer, to take risks than other sectors are. And we can ask the awkward questions, which sometimes can't be asked by others. And again, we keep asking ourselves when we're doing work, are we asking the questions that other people feel they can't ask about this? And this absolutely applies to what we do on well-being. And finally, and I'll come back to it just before I finish, really interesting, particularly to hear Alonso talking about learning, the philanthropic sector can afford to be generous and open with its learning, and it should be generous and open. We are not competing, or we shouldn't be competing, for credit or for who has the best insights, and we should see ourselves as being part of a big collaboration, not only with the sector, but also with people like you. So at Carnegie UK, our research and advocacy programme focuses on two aims, one of which is to grow support for a well-being approach in public policy in the UK and Ireland, so very much the stuff of today's discussions, but also at a deeper level to focus attention and understanding on some of those things which inhibit well-being or inhibit the attainment of well-being. And that's broadly been our approach for the last decade, very much influenced by Stiglitz and Fitoussi. And during that time, we've worked with many formal and kind of informal partners. So everything that I think and say about success and about learning is very definitely in the context of contribution rather than of attribution. And just to give a very quick sense of the kind of specifics that we've worked on, at that level of influencing governance, we've worked with jurisdictions in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in the northeast of England, to help them to embed an approach to governance which is based on wellbeing frameworks, the kind of frameworks we've heard a bit about already. We strongly believe that they're a necessary starting point. I guess some of the learning that we're currently reflecting on is, again, thinking back to what Gus was saying earlier, that the implementation is really hard. There are learnt behaviours, there are learnt incentives about what we measure, about how we organise our institutions, about how we budget and allocate money, which are really, really deeply ingrained. So I think there's a point in where we all need to be moving away from talking about how you start to helping to think about how you continue. And again, I think there should be a place for independent voices like ours as political enthusiasm waxes and wanes over time, to keep carrying the flame for these approaches. And then, as I say, we also go deep on some subjects. So over recent years, we've worked on the concept of kindness and advocating for much more relational approaches, both in communities and in public services. We've got a long-standing interest in the rise of digital media, both the opportunities that affords for well-being, but also the significant threats. And we hosted the development of the duty of care model for regulation of social media platforms, which form the basis of the online harms legislation that's making its way through the UK Parliament at the moment. And we believe in the value of community infrastructure. We've done a lot of work with the library sector, primarily in England, to help that sector to rethink how libraries can be places of well-being in the future. And then finally, and I've been discussing with a number of you here over the last few days, we have developed a new approach to measuring the well-being of England, what we call gross domestic well-being, or GDW for short. And that's based on the ONS 10 domains of well-being. It's primarily conceived of as a communications tool and something that we've been using to see whether it is possible, by using a single number to talk about well-being, to engage people in a conversation about how we measure the things and how we talk about things that they value. So finally, just very briefly, I want to say something about impact. I think one of the huge privileges that foundations have, and actually we've learned a lot from Robert Wood Johnson in relation to this, is the fact that we don't have to report on or measure impact according to anybody else's framework for it. We're not having to report to people, and we're therefore not having to fit in other people's sense of what it is we should be learning. And we really need to make the most of that opportunity. We've done a lot of work in the last year at Carnegie UK thinking about how we measure impact, and very much embracing what we've learned from Robert Wood Johnson and others about storytelling, about mixing the qualitative and the quantitative, about talking to people, about tailoring different measurement approach for different programs. When we do different things, we have to measure them differently, and critically recognizing complexity in change making. We know it gets squeezed out of the political narrative, but we shouldn't allow it to be squeezed out of ours. And again, it's great to have an opportunity to learn here today.
Well, it's great to hear about the focus on important but maybe kind of important topics which are sometimes a bit hard to take seriously in the public realm, like kindness. So I think that's great. And then finally, John, which I know the Templeton also, it takes a bold stand on important issues.
Hi, everybody. Hearing my colleagues talk about their new entry to philanthropy reminds me, as I tell you, that I've been in philanthropy 25 years now. My friend is a lobbyist in the States, which is not necessarily a profession you want to tell somebody you're doing in the States. I said to him, you can't tell your mother you're a lobbyist. What do you say? He said, I tell her I'm a piano player in a whorehouse. You know, these wonderful foundations accepted, the 100,000 or so foundations in the States have been contributors to the conditions we have today. So, you know, the inputs relate to the output. So as we imagine, can philanthropy save well-being and happiness? I think it's no. I think the more interesting question is, can well-being and happiness save philanthropy? Can we use well-being and happiness as a shared interest to pull ourselves away from the habit of making small idiosyncratic grants one at a time to something that, as we've heard, is a heavier lift. In a technical sense, we don't have the instruments at our disposal often to do long-term big lifts that focus on the same thing for an enduring commitment over time. To borrow from Professor Kahneman, it raises the question of delusional optimism. Why do we think there's going to be a different result based on what we're doing? So, you know, then it starts to think, well, what can we do? And I think one of the challenges for philanthropy, and again, speaking for the larger field, this is the all-star lineup that Jan has, but there's a tendency to fund individual projects, and both before I got here and hearing the presentations this week, there's two things really jump out. One is the need for increased attention to positive human relationships, broadly. If we had had a meeting like this 12 years ago, just set out on a global initiative to create negative human relationships, it would have been wildly successful. So something has done something to create this, right? And the positive human relationships feels nebulous, sometimes to funders who like to build museums or hospitals or art museum, wings to art museums. But we need to figure out, both in our policy, I'll mention an example in a minute, but related to that is also the learning, and I'm glad that's already come up, that our processes tend to follow inertia, and the downside, I love Sarah's optimism, I need to go to Edinburgh for a dose. The downside of not being accountable is we're not accountable. So the foundations aren't accountable to anybody, and we can move slowly or focus on whatever we want to focus on, and coming together in a shared commitment is a challenge. And part of that learning is understanding these things we crave. I was with a colleague that many of you know, Laurie Santos, last week at another meeting, and talking about, the brain may crave the sugar or the alcohol or the hit from seeing that somebody liked something I posted. And my life is better when I go for a walk in the botanical garden and talk to my sister and visit a friend, but somehow my brain doesn't crave those things as well as it does the other, as much as it does the other. And one of the things that we go down these different roads, whether it's empathy fatigue or questions about these things, and a lot of the roads lead back to reflection. It came up yesterday in the difference between watching TV passively or spending time in reflection and mindfulness. And so some of the greatest gifts we could give, I think, through philanthropy would be space and time, to create space and time, which are scarce, and we're over-programming in terms of the young people's programs. I mean, I've worked in community-based philanthropy in Atlanta, a city in the States I know well. The Boys and Girls Clubs of Metro Atlanta serves about 2,000 kids a day. It runs them from computer tutoring to homework help to this and this throughout the afternoon, because the project funders, the funders of the projects want these metrics, as opposed to saying this is going to be 3 hours after school where you have the luxury to form positive relationships and learn about life and reflect on these decisions you're going to make. So I think if there's a way we can shift policy, I guess with a small p, though there may be some government decisions too. Schools don't do well at creating time for reflection. Certainly offices don't. Jan was at a meeting with me a few years ago where our founder was insistent there be time built in for reflection. And all of our instincts still want to over-program from meeting to meeting to meeting. So I think I would say if we can find a way in philanthropy to recognize the value of time and space for positive human relationships that we build, and for learning. And right now, the decisions we're making continue to go often down the bad road. I guess it's a lot of economists here. I was always taught the first rule of holes is to stop digging. And we before we even turn it around, we got to stop digging, because every day it seems a little worse. So I was inspired by Professor Oswald to be cheerful. So.
Well, speaking of time and space, it is nearly lunchtime, but hopefully there's a chance to squeeze in a couple of questions. So, yeah, questions from the audience, please. Yep.
Thank you for the lovely panel. I was just reflecting on the time and space on the other side of the coin of those producing the research, and how maybe philanthropy and those funding mechanisms that drive you to always think about the new project, the new way we can bring in money in the whole academic system around it, how maybe we could change that as well to provide a bit more time and space for, and maybe fallow periods, to really reconsider. I was wondering if any of you had some reflections on the importance of that for those also producing those new ideas and new research. Thank you.
That's exactly right. I mean, and John mentioned the field can get too tied into short-term, multiple, discrete funding. I think we're learning both in our broader community programmatic work and our research work that we need much more flexibility. We need time, we need a co-generative process around the ideas and the priorities. We need to be a catalyst for transdisciplinary thinking and the time it takes for different disciplines to develop the muscles to do that. So yeah, we thought we have far from solved that, but that's how we're thinking about it. And we don't want to replicate the model from our governmental funders. That is just 3 years out. Yeah.
Very briefly, and then we'll try and take one or two more questions.
We also don't have all the solutions by any means, but we have a whole team on research environment trying to work out how best to manage this. We are open to any suggestions or thoughts you have. We're also aware of the differential effects on people with care and responsibilities or other factors, and really want to work out best ways to take that into account.
Great. So we've got one over there.
I'm very pleased to hear that you're really interested in looking at young people's mental health. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the fact that, I think I speak for quite a few young people, that there's a trend of losing trust in the government and adults and policy, especially post-secondary education, when there's nothing in place to enforce any sort of interventions for mental health, and so how you think that we can sort of get past that problem of lack of trust, lack of engagement in mental health interventions.
So that's a spot-on question, and if you think about it from a young person's perspective, as we have really wide sort of gaps in the resources that we're allocating to the younger cohorts and the older cohorts, I think one of the things we need to be careful in the well-being space is not to plow on well-being whilst not recognizing that there are also economic realities here that are also really quite challenging for young people as they're coming through the system. And that's where the lack of trust comes, right? Because it's fine to talk about well-being, but hang on, I can't buy a house. And my job prospects are not as good as the previous generations. And it's this, and I guess that was part of my point about this is a complex piece, right? There are lots and lots of drivers of low well-being. And actually, you might think of low well-being, particularly amongst the young, as the warning sign that things are awry, and therefore the kinds of solutions that we come up with cannot just be focused on fixing well-being. It has to be broader than that. In terms of rebuilding trust, well, I mean, I'm glad that there is someone in the room representing young people. I do think having more of those voices in some of the discussions we've had would help in that respect. And as I say, tackling the realities of economic inequalities alongside well-being is obviously pretty key as well.
So I recognise we are between you and your lunch, but I know that so one thing that many of us are even more excited about than lunch is funding. So Alonso just asked me to set him up for any kind of make a comment on funding, and I would say the same thing for audience members if there's other comments about funding or anything else you want to leave the audience with before we hit the food.
Yeah, I forgot the bottom line that we are open for funding. For the international partners, our global program is the entry point, and Claire Gibbons is here. Raise your hand, Claire, who's on that senior program officer on the global team. But we look on our website for a number of different announcements for funding the kinds of things that I was talking about, particularly this combined top-down, bottom-up strategy to kind of transform the way we think about well-being in the States.
Any of the other panel to make a quick...
We have an open call for inquiries every year. I think August 19th is the date. So it's not a full proposal, it's the submitting an inquiry, and it's open to anybody in the world. You don't need a meeting or a permission or an invitation. So templetonfoundation.org, I don't know our website, it's something close. And go to Google Grant Calendar or how to apply for a grant, and you'll see the deadlines and the way to submit.
I guess it's just worth saying that our discovery open calls are open only to leads from the UK or from low middle income countries, although it can be a collaboration internationally. But the health challenges, infection, mental health and climate are open globally.
Great. Well, let's thank our panel.
So you want us to start? Okay. Welcome, everybody, and I am so happy to be here with you today. My name is Karen Guggenheim. I am CEO, founder of the World Happiness Summit and WAHASU. The goal of our organization is actually to bring the amazing work in science that you all dedicate your lives to, and to bring notoriety and promote the practical implementations behind the science of well-being. And we do this to a global audience. We bring an expert community with, and gather with thought leaders, members of NGOs, government leaders, and the public at large. And so for me, it's such a privilege to be here. Thank you, Jan, for including us. And also to be here with this amazing panel of doers. They are the ones that are on the grounds and creating such positive change in the world. And so today I was asked, are you optimistic about the future? And I have to say that I am. And although my personal life has not been all flowers and have experienced the personal trauma and loss, I can tell you that because of people like this who are here today, there is a lot to be hopeful for. Certainly life is not perfect, will never be perfect, but there are so many initiatives that are evidence-based that are happening today. So I am so honored to be with Jonathan, Dexter, Sue, and Mark, who will share about their different initiatives. So Jonathan Rose, he's a leader in the integration of business, public policy, and nonprofit work to create environmentally, socially, and economically resilient communities. Gosh, if we can be anything, let's be resilient. And he is the author of The Well-Tempered City. I am so excited to hear from you about the initiatives that you are leading, and perhaps you can share some of the challenges and then some of the opportunities that we can see to create better communities that are engaged for well-being.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you all for being here. It's been fascinating. I founded and lead a company that builds affordable housing throughout the United States, and we buy existing affordable housing and transform it. And our view is that a safe, green, non-toxic, affordable housing is an essential platform for well-being. It is necessary but not sufficient. There is such a housing crisis in the United States, and by the way, in many other countries of the world, that there's an enormous pressure simply to provide the housing. And we recognize that that's completely insufficient. We have a model we call developing communities of opportunity, and we say that this housing has to be integrated with on-site health care, access to job training and jobs, mass transportation, access to healthy food, after-school education, computers, digital access, a whole series of things that together, if you've studied the social determinants of health, we know are the necessary conditions to create, to move people ahead in their lives and do what we call creating opportunities. And then the other thing we know, which has also been so much part of your work, is that you have to build a trusting community, you have to build a connected community. People have to, that everything we're talking about is a relational subject. We actually live in a world, if you think about it, our economic world was constructed often around the idea of individual maximization, but our theory is we're really looking for collective optimization. We do this in two ways. We build amazing new projects. Our projects are often models of the future that we want to create and then are getting duplicated. So for example, we have a project in East Harlem today that is 700 units of mixed income housing, housing families from formerly homeless to middle income. It is the greenest, it's built to a standard called Passive House, which is a German standard, super green. The green is very important not only from an environmental energy point of view, but also non-toxic point of view. Many low-income children, for example, miss school because they have asthma. And so we know that when we create green environments, we're using non-toxic materials, there's a much higher school attendance rate because the kids are much healthier. Then we also know that low-income kids often lack access, digital access. Their parents can't afford the internet or are not sharing the internet and can't afford devices. And they're not living in a digital culture. So that's another thing that we're bringing the kids. And then another thing is after school education. Many wealthier families have tutoring, or they have the kids are taken to a library, they're in a culture of reading. And so we're trying to create those things. And what we're looking at is then not only what are these individual actions, but what are the interdependencies amongst them. And so we've put together a research consortium with Harvard Chan School of Public Health, the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health, Dartmouth has a health economics group, Enterprise Community Partners, and NeighborWorks, 2 national not-for-profits. And this group of 5 have now received a large grant from the JPB Foundation, so we're studying the efficacy of this work. What's interesting about it, though, is there's another thing that we've also talked a lot about today and yesterday, which is empowerment. And that people need to feel empowered to have a sense of the future. So all these programs that we do under a model called co-creation. So we alone are not deciding what the work will be. There's several people, the residents themselves are deciding what they'll be. And also we do it all in partnership with local not-for-profits, local healthcare organizations, hospitals, et cetera. And so it all depends on what's available. So for example, if there's a great after-school program in education, we can bring it to our housing, but if there isn't one, we can't. So it requires an ecology of action. So I just want to tell a brief story, which is we had a project in inner city Newark, about 1,000 people living on a block that we bought that was, so I think I mentioned we both build new, but we also buy existing affordable housing, which is often those big concrete ugly buildings in places that most of you would not want to live, and then we try and figure out how to transform them. And we had heard that what the teenagers really wanted was a basketball court. And in conditions like that, basketball courts are about the most dangerous thing you can do because that's where gangs get together and fight, and it's generally not a good circumstance. But we'd committed to this idea of co-creation, and so we turned to the community and said, we're going to invest in what you want. And I held my breath because I was really afraid, but it turns out they all got together, and what they said they wanted were arts and education programs, because those had all been cut from their schools. And so we partnered with the Newark Symphony, the Newark Art Museum, and a whole series of amazing cultural programs in Newark. We brought these amazing arts and education programs that the community was really woven around it. Every elderly person then had like the story of their life on their door, their apartment, all kind of made out of, anyway, all this amazing stuff. And after 5 years of this amazing community building, one day we turned to the community and said, hey, would you guys like a basketball court? And they said, yes, and now we have this very friendly, peaceful basketball court. So anyway, the point is that, my last point is, so when it came to research, I mean, here we're trying to do this research that'll compare the efficacy of our work, that has got to be a gold standard, it's got to be double-blind and compared and all that stuff. So the challenge we have is, how do we co-create this? Because we're saying to the residents, you get to co-decide what we're going to research, because we're asking you to participate in it, which means the research is going to be different in every community. We think that there's going to be really meaningful output that comes from that. And the reason I raise that is that I suggest that in the subject of research about well-being, sometimes we squeeze the subject matter into a model to try and get the most accurate outcomes, but sometimes we lose things in that squeezing. And so I think we have to be just careful as we think about research design.
Excellent, wonderful. Those initiatives are amazing, and I just love the idea of bringing so many different partners together, because that is true community building. That's much of the work that you do, Dexter, as president of the Blue Zones Wellbeing Institute. You're responsible for the strategy and solutions within the Wellbeing Division to empower individuals and organizations and communities. I'm particularly interested about this living lab to create and codify best practices, including lifestyle medicine. I know you're a physician, and so I'd love for you to share with our audience about the initiatives that you're doing, and also the partnerships that you are collaborating with to make this possible.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, it's interesting because we're talking about best practice. So a lot of the things that Jonathan just talked about are also things that we're involved in as well. So Blue Zones, for those who may not know, is really about research. That's where it really started. And Dan Buettner and National Geographic, National Institutes of Aging, went around the world to find the fountain of youth. And what they found were 5 communities in the world where people tend to live very old, centenarians. They live to be over 100 years old, and they're healthy. They don't have the kinds of diseases and chronic conditions that we would imagine people at that age would have. And they're happy too, right? And so what they found, these different communities were all over the world. There was one in North America, but there was one in Greece and Japan, but they had some common elements. They had 9 elements that we call the Power 9. And so the idea was, can you take those common elements, re-engineer them and put them in other communities and get similar results? And so that's the track that we've been on for a number of years now. We're now in 72 communities just in the United States alone, and we're replicating these models. And it's been very successful, and we have found things that work, and I can talk about challenges as well, because there are always challenges. But one of the things that we do is that we really need to make sure that those communities want to change, that they're doing it for reasons that are important to them, sort of as what you were saying. We go in, we talk about doing an assessment. Where's leadership? Is leadership on board? And it's not just one segment. It needs to be government, but also employers, communities. So we want to have a critical mass of leadership that's on board. We can then do this assessment. Where is that community? And we ask the community, what do you want? What does success look like for you? So every community is a little bit different. We have hundreds of policies, hundreds of things that we know can work, but each community is a little bit different, and so not every community will reach for the same kinds of things. All of those things are based around changing the environment. When we talk about changing the environment, we talk about doing it for people, places, and policy. And policy is actually the wrap around all those things. So for individuals, we may make some changes in their home environment. Places where they work, we might make some changes in the work environment, community environment, those kinds of things. But all of those things might require a bit of policy. One of the things that we were talking about before we got started is that some of the things that we do in the Institute now is we're trying to put health systems and what they're trying to achieve in those communities along with what the community is trying to achieve for itself. That's not done usually in the United States. But then you think about policy, it's not just infrastructure policy, but it's also reimbursement policy. So we're now running some randomized controlled trials around food as medicine and actually seeing how do we embed that into the benefit design so that now that gets to thinking about food and sustainability in a different way because we're actually now able to pay for it and incentivize it the same way you would a generic drug in some instances. So those are some of the things that we're doing. Now, in terms of challenges, anytime you deal with people, you have challenges. And so you have to, we're really built on forming coalitions, working together. We're very proud of the fact how we bring people together. But anytime you have to do that, sometimes it's a slow process. And I will say that our programs or projects are anywhere from 3 to 10 years. So it's a long-term commitment, but it gives us time to bring these coalitions together and really look at some outcomes. Our outcomes, we look at the Well-Being Index as one of them, but again, we also look at healthcare costs, given that we're in the United States, and that's very important. And what these organizations have seen is that as well-being goes up, healthcare costs go down. In some of our communities, we've seen as much as a 40% reduction in healthcare costs. That's important for these communities, particularly those that are self-funded. If you think about municipalities, they can use that money to reinvest into the communities. So it's a win-win when we look at it that way.
Love that. It makes me think of almost like a well-being piggy bank, right? Mm-hmm. So you can take the cost savings, put it somewhere else, and invest in these amazing programs. And using the data, you're really making a case for well-being. And I think using the language that leaders understand, which brings me to to Sue Paulus. Sue directs the Health and Wellbeing portfolio for the National League of Cities as part of the Institute for Youth, Education and Families. She has expertise in health policy and spans the connection of housing, economic opportunities, mental health, substance use disorders, obesity, trauma, and local systems alignment and data for well-being. That is a lot, and what is really exciting is how you empower and support government leaders on a city, village level to make this, this data available so that it can take actions and improve the communities in which they operate. So can you share more about the initiatives that you lead, and then how we can improve well-being perhaps in some of these localities?
Thank you, Karen, and what a pleasure to be here today with so many experts talking about something exciting like well-being and improving holistic well-being. As Karen said, I work with the National League of Cities, so our journey really is to walk alongside local elected officials, mayors, city council members in the US, and try to really help them as they work to address some of the challenges we've been talking about the last couple of days, right? So whether that's housing, infrastructure, you know, a range of issues, including homelessness and mental health, so many of the things we've been talking about. And so as the Health and Wellbeing portfolio, right, our work is really to help connect those challenges to health and well-being, right? And so developing that lens. And the data, especially some of the dashboards, the well-being measures we've been talking about, are essential, right, to mindset shift. If we're going to transform communities, the data, and we've heard this from Republican and Democratic mayors and city council members, the data demonstrates, right, where those concentrated disparities are. And so it's unifying in the sense that you can see quite plainly, right, in zip codes across the country where those concentrated disparities are, which every city has. And so we designed it with the support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Of course, Alonzo and Claire are here. We've developed what we call Cities of Opportunity. And the design is really to meet the cities where they're at, because as we said, local context is different. State environments, right, are quite different in the US. So you can have a great policy idea locally, but it can be preempted by the state, right? And so a lot of our work is to apply capacity building and intentionality, right, around these issues that are so systemic. And when I read Jonathan's book, I thought, wow, somebody's really thought about this extensively and has studied cities from their evolution. You know, it was fascinating read. And I thought, wow, you know, this really reinforces why cities of opportunity, communities of opportunity, you know, it doesn't matter what you call it. It matters that we're really walking alongside and supporting cities, because when we talk about data, when we talk about systems alignment, who trains for that? You don't run for public office because you want to work with data and do systems alignment. You run for public office because you want to solve the problems in your community. And so expecting that cities have that capacity, even though everyone wants communities doing the policy work, is really the nexus of our work, right? And so we build the muscle. We help cities build their capacity. And it all starts with data. So last year, Jan and I were able to partner with the support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, with John Baer, who at the time was with the Blank Foundation, now with the Templeton Foundation. We got to partner and really sort of look across US cities. What's happening? What are they doing? And so we found several examples of how cities are using well-being measures. They don't call them well-being measures. They call them equity measures, because it's all about having enough data on the factors that influence health and well-being, right? So our housing, our transportation, right? Our economic opportunity, our schools, our access to early childhood programs, right? It's not one of those things, it's all of those things. So just as an example, Tacoma, Washington, which some of you may be familiar with, they have an equity dashboard. And that gives you a great picture and really supports mindset shift and brings people to the table. So we help them bring those sector partners to the table. And then we help them apply the data, right? Because that high-level data is essential to building the table. But it's not enough to inform policy design, right? And so what we've done, like with Tacoma, we talk about a livable wage. Well, what is that? So we help them through our data define a livable wage, which in Tacoma, Washington is $24 an hour. And then they said, okay, we know what the livable wage is. What's the sector growth in the city? It's healthcare, because through COVID, the demand was so high, right? So they knew they wanted to support workforce training in healthcare, but then to what end, right? And for who? And so they looked at their data and they identified 2 communities with very high numbers of concentrated disparities in education and income and health. And they talked to the communities, and they started a pilot, an earn and learn pilot, is what they call it. And the community, right, the Salishan community is where they are starting. And so not are they just supporting the workforce training, because they spoke to the community, and the community said, it's wonderful to have this kind of a pilot, but what we really need is cash and housing as we're in the pilot, because how do we survive, right? And so the workforce board supported the stipends for people to participate. They're using their American Rescue Plan Act dollars, which is a federal policy that enables local cities to define how they want to use those dollars. So they're using their ARPA dollars to support wraparound services, and the Housing Authority is providing the housing. Now, this is a pilot, right? So they're evaluating it, and the goal is to hope to grow. But those partners were around the table. What catalyzed this braiding and blending of funding and systems alignment was the data. But the data itself doesn't do the work. It's the ability to analyze and apply the data to the policy mechanism. And so if you ask me, what's the greatest need? We need model policies that can be applied based on local context and state environments, because it's not enough to just put the policy out. It has to be co-designed, co-created with the community. And so, that's really the genesis of the work and what we're doing.
Fantastic. It's almost like having a subjective well-being of cities, right? And how it's adaptable to each one. I also really like how you've been able to do something quite difficult, which I think is to bring local policy to the federal level, which is very challenging. So congratulations on that. Mark Williamson is a co-founder and director of Action for Happiness, which is an amazing organization that also Richard is very involved with. And it's really about co-creating a happier, kinder world, and also decreasing misery at the same time. So I think it's wonderful how you have been able to create these communities in these circles to empower people and co-create opportunities where people can feel better, and also bring in the data, right, and to make it actionable. I just love the name of your organization, Action for Happiness. I think it's brilliant, and it's so down to earth and practical. Can you tell us more about, and especially what's happened in the last 2 years, because I know that there's a lot that's happened in the circles.
Thank you, Karen. That's a lovely introduction. It's lovely to be here with you all. Can you hear me at the back? Give me a wave. So yes, Action for Happiness, one of, I don't know if it's but certainly one of the biggest communities of people taking action towards global well-being. We have had our resources used by tens of millions of people, and we have 300,000 members in 190 countries. So, well, actually, before I say a bit more about that, I'm conscious that we're at a wellbeing and research conference, and there's been a lot of thinking, a lot of intellectual, incredibly inspiring conversation, but there's been more of the research and policy and less of the well-being. So I'd like to invite you all to join me for 30 seconds of well-being before we talk a bit more about the thinking. So pop your phone down or your laptop down, whatever you're doing. Maybe just take a moment just to take a breath and just maybe tune into how your body's feeling right now. Take a slightly deeper than normal breath and just notice how you're feeling. Just bring your attention to that lived experience of what's happening right now, without any kind of judgment, just noticing how you're feeling both physically, but also what's the weather pattern like inside? How are you feeling emotionally right now? And then I'd like to invite you to bring to mind one thing that you're grateful for right now. It could be a really big thing, a major achievement, a fantastic recent success, or it could be a tiny moment, a friendly smile, the sunshine, a conversation, an idea. Just bring to mind something that you feel grateful for. And then as we return back into the room, maybe just take a moment just to have a little stretch and move your body physically a little bit as well. We know that all of these things, being mindful, being grateful, being physically active, are also, I nearly hit you in the face there, apologies, are all great for our well-being. But the point here is that actions make a difference. Of course, the systemic policy, international, national, local government action is vital, but also our individual actions make a difference. And actually, crucially, together in communities, we can really transform our own well-being and affect the well-being of others around us. So in Action for Happiness, we talk about happier, kinder, together. So happier is about we can take action to improve our own well-being. Kinder is about we can actually take action to help other people improve their well-being in really tangible ways. And the together is twofold, really. Firstly, it's both of those things are interlinked, that when we're good to others, we feel better, and also, when we feel better, we're more likely to be kind to others. But the together is also, as Karen was alluding, the bringing together of people. This is where we can transform our well-being. So to give you just two examples of what we've been doing with Action for Happiness globally, we have a calendar, a monthly action calendar with a theme that anyone who knows about behavioural science would know is a terrible idea, because it has basically a single action every day to improve your well-being. And people don't like prescriptive lists. Nobody can possibly do all of them. As a behavioural intervention, it should be an absolute disaster. And yet this has been downloaded and used by 35 million people now. Every month follows a slightly painful alliterating theme, from Active April and Meaningful May through to Joyful June and Self-Care September. They're all grounded in the science, all the great research that you and many others do, but they're making it practical. They're reminding people that the actions they take can make a difference for themselves and others. So the reason a calendar works, we think, is it's very simple. They go up on school notice boards, they go up in workplaces all the time, they're shared massively on social. They're thematic, so you feel part of something bigger. But the idea of the calendar and a small daily action is that the things you do can make a difference for your well-being. So that's a sort of at the initial interaction level, very high level. Of course, to really transform well-being, we need to go deeper. So we have volunteers all across the UK initially, and now all around the world, running activities that bring people together face-to-face, particularly a course we developed, the Action for Happiness course, which people get together for a number of weeks and they learn some of these skills together. They talk about them, they understand the research, but crucially they put it into practice. They have conversations together. They go away with an action plan for themselves that they've thought of. That this week I'm going to try and meditate every day. I'm going to visit an elderly neighbour who may be feeling isolated. I'm going to just try and go to bed slightly earlier, or be kind to my spouse, whatever it might be. And they come back the week after and they talk about how that's been, and they share together as a group. And they say things like, oh, you feel that way too. And actually, this has made a really big difference. And so we knew it was working anecdotally, but we wanted to find out. So we, with great support from some academics like Jan de Neve here and others, a full randomized control trial was done of this intervention. And we found that it had really substantial benefits. 1 point on the 10-point scale of life satisfaction maintained many months after the course. Big reductions in depression and anxiety, and crucially, what I'm most pleased about is big increases in pro-social measures like social trust and compassion. So people do become happier and kinder together when they get together. But I guess the thing, coming back to your point about the last 2 years, well, first of all, COVID has had a huge impact on people being able to do this. All of our face-to-face volunteer-led activity closed down in the pandemic, and that was dreadful, actually, really upsetting and really hard work to respond to. But it drove everybody, as you all know, onto Zoom and other platforms, and it encouraged a lot of innovation. So we launched a new digital program that people can do by themselves, and there's a fantastic new version of that just gone live. If you go to 10daysofhappiness.org, free 10-day evidence-based action program, 80,000 people have taken it, seems to have really substantial impact on well-being, all evidence-based. But we also allowed our volunteers to run these local groups via Zoom, so it's face-to-face still, but it's on screen. And actually they were remarkable in terms of people still wanting to get together and actually reaching people who didn't come to face-to-face things before because of social anxiety, maybe too much geographic distance. Maybe someone recently said, I love these Zoom sessions because I can't normally hear when I'm in the cafe or the local community centre, but I can hear when I'm on Zoom, which is a nice insight. So that actually led to, there's been many disasters of COVID. One of the upsides, as well as, I think, people talking about mental health a lot more, which is a big upside of COVID, we have also seen a 10-fold increase in people engaging with some of these initiatives because it's become more accessible and more people are able to access them digitally. But I think the one message I wanted to leave, which I'm sure is reflected in all the fantastic work we've heard about here on the panel, is that I don't think the problem we all face to create a happier world is not knowing what the right actions are. The problem we face is helping people change their behavior. Knowing that good relationships, being physically active, having a sense of resilience and being mindful, that's fairly straightforward. Building it into your life is really hard. And so we now think a lot about the user journey, as we might call it, which is how do you grab someone's attention? Turns out a calendar shared online on a notice board is a pretty good way of getting millions of people's attention. How do you then bring them on a journey? So we now have regular webinars with expert speakers that people come to every couple of weeks. We've had over 250,000 people join us live on Zoom in the last sort of recent months for these events, which is quite remarkable. And then they might go a bit deeper with this digital program I mentioned. And then what we really want them to do is to come to a face-to-face experience and have ongoing monthly groups, which are now running in hundreds of locations around the world, following these monthly themes. But people aren't ready to go straight there. They say things like, well, what is a well-being group? What's a happiness course? I don't know what that is. But if they've been brought on this journey, they're ready to make that change. So my challenge, I think, to all of us is, how do we understand behavior change as much as how we understand well-being interventions?
Excellent. And a lot of your community ends up going to the World Happiness Summit, which makes perfect sense, I guess. Something that we were talking about before, which to me is really exciting, is that it ripples out, right? And so where you have people that perhaps were very low on well-being and happiness, then they go through the process of learning and taking action, and then it fuels their actions further to then help others and increases a sense of altruism and to bring this beyond the self, which is what we want to do with the communities that we're all co-creating. Jonathan, what does a well-tempered city look like? What are the attributes of that?
It's, rather than go through all the attributes and give a long talk about it, I would just say that, so I'm going to give you where the idea came from. Okay, so Bach wrote this amazing piece of music called The Well-Tempered Clavier. And The Well-Tempered Clavier was actually, what was interesting is that before the Western music was it was tuned in a certain way so that every scale was separate, and a tuning system came from China and came to Europe, and in the late 1680s we created this thing called temperament that allowed us to tune things in a way that you could then go from key to key to key and integrate them all. And at the same time, the clavier was invented, and the clavier was the forerunner of the piano. And I view this as having a software and a hardware, new hardware system, new software system, that then unleashed Bach to be able to create this extraordinary music. And his vision was actually to take, because he was a deeply spiritual person, a vision of the entire universe and its magnificent architecture and represent it through this integration of music. So the Well-Tempered City does the same thing. The Well-Tempered City aspires also to take all the magnificence of nature and the unfolding patterns of how the real world really can work at its very best, which we see all as individual segments, and using technologies and new operating systems actually figure out how to integrate them into a co-emerging magnificent whole. So it's a place that you would really want to live, and where nature would also thrive. And it's and this all sounds very hypothetical. So then, but the idea is how do we actually practically implement these things? Anyway, the book draws on a lot of very practical ways to implement these, and there are places around the world where these ideas continue to thrive.
Fantastic. So it's about being in alignment. I don't want to monopolize all the questions. I know that we have an amazing, esteemed group of people here. So I'm opening up the floor for questions.
I can just say one thing.
Absolutely. Yes.
I wanted to just comment on what Mark was saying about the data. And while data is actually very important, I know this is the big thing here for the conference, we like to say that we're data-driven, but we're also data-informed. And what we mean by that is that we don't have to have perfect data in order to start the process, right? And to get going. So sometimes, they say the enemy of, good is the perfect or whatever. And so we are driven by data, but we are also informed by it, and we have enough oftentimes just to get the ball rolling. And so I just wanted to sort of say in terms of the practical application of this. And then the other thing I just want to say real quickly is that we also focus, we're known for focusing on the community, but we also focus on individuals as well, because I agree. We have something called the Blue Zone Challenge, which is really directed at the individual. How do you do those kinds of things that we all know lead to well-being, such as kindness, forgiveness, gratitude, those kinds of things into your life that we know can lift the individual. And then you're doing this in the community so that the community then surrounds and supports that individual as well. The combination of those things can be very powerful.
Fantastic. So I think right here in the front.
Okay, so my question is wanting to hear all of your thoughts on the process of engaging the community to co-create, especially if the community does not understand that, yes, there are certain changes that needs to be done. Where do we start? If we are going to measure certain attributes to show them data, yes, we need to change greenery areas, we need to change social cohesion, etc. But they don't have that trust. So it was like, oh my God, there's another survey. How do you engage people to have the willingness to co-create and be eager for that certain change? And the other part of the question, how do we sustain that change? I guess that question for you, sir.
I'm happy to start. I think what silver lining of COVID perhaps is the intentionality around that at least I'm seeing among local elected officials, right? That the community has to not just be at the table, right, but be co-designing. And I think Tacoma was one example, right, where they went to the community and said, what do you need? From Roanoke, Virginia, little south of Washington, D.C., where I live, it was all about establishing trust. Public trust has really been eroded through COVID, and so I think there's a recognition of the need to establish trust, especially in communities that really have no reason to trust that people have their best intentions at heart. So, I think what we're seeing sort of happening around this community co-creation is things like using the data in one example to fix streetlights, right? Fix sidewalks in neighborhoods, right? Build some credibility with the community about investing in things that they've been asking for a really long time. So that American Rescue Plan Act money in some of these, situations like in Roanoke, that's where they use that money to establish credibility and trust. And now they can have a deeper conversation, and they're working toward what they call equitable budgeting, right? Trying to get the community more engaged in those budget allocations. And the American Rescue Plan Act is an outlier because those dollars went directly to cities. In the US, most of it goes through states and then trickles down. And it's really hard to get transformation because a lot of those federal funding streams in the US come with very specific parameters about how the money can be used. And so that pushes all the burden down on the local communities to figure out how those funds need to work together. And so by engaging the community, when cities are doing this work, they need the political will, yes, of mayors and local council members, But the community gives them the credibility for why they're making those changes. And I think that's what's different now than before in terms of the trajectory, at least that I'm seeing with the cities that we're working with.
Thank you so much. We started a little bit late, so we're going to have to take the rest of the questions maybe at the break. So thank you so much, everyone. Jonathan, Dexter, Sue, Mark, for your amazing work. Thank you, and thank you for sharing with us today.